Hi guys. Tonight we step together into a place where warmth is a distant memory, where stone swallows sound and cold clings to your skin as though it were alive. You descend into a medieval dungeon, and almost instantly you understand why surviving even a single night here feels impossible. The air cuts at your lungs like tiny shards of ice, and the stones beneath your boots seem to leach heat straight from your bones. You probably won't survive this. But we're here, side by side, imagining the impossible. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love for you to post your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights and step carefully, because the stones are slick and the air is already tightening around you. The corridor stretches ahead, narrow, made of rough-hewn blocks. Each one is damp to the touch, moisture gathering like sweat on a body that cannot breathe. You trail your fingers against them and recoil, as the chill transfers instantly into your skin. The medieval builders knew how to stack stones that endured centuries, but they also created chambers that seemed to amplify misery. Historians still argue whether dungeons were always meant for long imprisonment, or whether they were temporary holding spaces until judgment. What they all agree on, though, is how unforgiving the environment was. A torch mounted high sputters weakly, its flame too small to challenge the damp. The orange glow is swallowed quickly by blackness, and beyond its reach you can hear water dripping, each drop a hollow echo bouncing endlessly. You pause, wondering whether the builders noticed these acoustics, or if it was just a cruel accident of design. Either way, the sound becomes your heartbeat's companion. Steady, intrusive, impossible to ignore. You inhale, and the dungeon exhales. A smell of old straw, mold, and rust settles into your throat. It is the smell of centuries pressed into stone. The Romans, too, had underground prisons, often called carcer, where darkness and chill did the punishing long before a sentence was carried out. Some scholars suggest medieval Europe borrowed this idea, mixing it with their own fears of sin and damnation. Others argue dungeons were less common than we imagine, and much of what we picture is later myth. Still, here in your mind's eye, the damp stone corridor is very real. Your foot scuffs something brittle, a rat's bone perhaps, or just a shard of long splintered wood. You can't be sure, and in truth, you don't want to know. The cold insists you keep moving, because to stop is to let it sink deeper. You pull your cloak imaginary, though it is tighter around you, but the air presses in regardless, as though the very stones radiate their own hunger for body heat. A quirky little detail. Archaeologists sometimes find bits of old wax pressed into dungeon walls, remnants of candles that prisoners or maybe guards wedged in desperation. Imagine someone huddling here centuries ago, staring at the same dripping stones, clutching a tiny flame, and whispering a prayer. The wax still clings like ghosts to the walls, even after the prisoners' names are long forgotten. As you walk further, the cold corridors seem to narrow. Shadows stretch into shapes that resemble grasping arms. Your body reacts before your mind does. Goosebumps rise along your arms, and your steps quicken. You may remind yourself it's only imagination, yet your muscles shiver as though they know this place has already claimed countless souls. And so, your first lesson is simple. The dungeon is not just walls and darkness. It is an organism that feeds on warmth, breath, and sound. It thrives on the steady drip of water, the squeak of unseen rats, the metallic tang of rust. It is alive in its own cruel way, and you, just by being here, are already losing strength to its embrace. The stone steps beneath your feet angle downward now, winding deeper into the bowels of the keep. Each tread is slick with damp, carved unevenly, so that your footing falters no matter how carefully you plant your heel. The descent itself feels endless, as though the builders meant for every prisoner to sense the slow, deliberate spiral into despair. You clutch the rough wall to steady yourself, and the moss growing there clings like a wet sponge to your palm. The torchlight fades behind you, leaving only a memory of its glow. Here, The darkness does not simply exist, it presses in. Your eyes strain to adjust, but the blackness feels heavier than any midnight you've ever known. The cold, too, intensifies with each step, sliding into your lungs so that your breath puffs out in pale ghosts, dissolving quickly, as though they too are unwilling to linger in this place. Historians still debate the true depth of many dungeons, some claiming they were scarcely underground at all, others insisting that noble castles dug labyrinths far below the earth. In truth, the variations are wide. The Tower of London held its prisoners high above ground, in chambers that were bleak but not buried. Yet in France and Germany, some keeps possessed true underground vaults, sunlight never once touching their walls. What unites them all is the design, a calculated stripping of warmth, light, and hope. Your boots scrape metal as you descend further, a loose iron ring fixed into the wall, the kind meant for chains. The clang reverberates, startling in the silence, and you imagine the sound magnified when a prisoner tugged desperately against it. Archaeological surveys have uncovered such rings in castle basements, their rust fused into stone itself. Were they ever actually used, or added later to frighten the imagination? Scholars disagree. But here, in your mind's descent, they are cold proof of suffering. A quirky tidbit. In some medieval chronicles, prisoners were said to be led downward, while musicians above played cheerful songs, drowning out the clatter of chains. Imagine that contrast. Fiddles and drums overhead, while below, the only accompaniment is the hiss of your breath and the slap of water dripping endlessly. The thought itself unsettles you more than silence could. You pause at a landing, ears pricked. Somewhere above, faint and muffled, comes the scrape of a guard's boots. The sound reminds you that life continues above, indifferent to your descent. Bread is baked, fires roar. Laughter fills the hall, but none of it pierces down here. You are sealed off, exiled into a kingdom of stone and frost. At the next turn, the ceiling lowers, forcing you to duck. The air thickens with the smell of damp iron and mouldy straw. Here, droplets gather along the ceiling until they release, one after another, onto the steps below. You hear each drop slap stone, and then your own heartbeat starts to sync with it. Thud, drip, thud, drip. The rhythm is hypnotic, and suddenly you realize the dungeon is already training you to its own tempo. Think, too, of the symbolism. Medieval lords valued spectacle. Punishment was not merely physical but psychological. The descent itself was theatre, meant to break your spirit before you ever reached the cell. Some historians believe these corridors were designed deliberately narrow and echoing, to magnify dread. Others suggest it was simply the practicality of medieval engineering. The truth may lie somewhere between form and function, blending into cruelty. You reach another iron-barred gate, its bars black with age, the hinges stiff and groaning when nudged. Beyond it yawns another stairwell, darker still. Your hand hesitates on the handle, for even in this imagining, you can feel how heavy the decision is. Step forward or turn back. Of course, you cannot turn back. The story pulls you down, and the dungeon welcomes you further inside. And so, the descent continues, each step colder, each shadow thicker, each sound magnified until your senses are raw. You might have thought the hardest part was already behind you, but the truth is crueler. The real dungeon has not even begun. The air thickens as you reach the bottom of the stairwell, and for a moment you hesitate, not because of what you see, but because of what you feel pressing against your skin. It is as if the dungeon itself breathes, each exhale wrapping around you with damp fingers. Your breath turns into vapor almost instantly, hanging for a moment before fading into the shadows. You notice how the moisture clings to the walls, creating streaks of green where moss has forced its way into the stone. You could almost believe the walls are alive, sweating, whispering their secrets in a language too old to understand. The narrow corridor ahead seems endless. With every step you take, your boots splash into shallow puddles left by centuries of trickling water. The sound echoes in a hollow rhythm, giving the impression that someone else walks with you, just out of sight. You shiver, not just from the chill, but from the sense of being followed. Dungeons had a reputation for being places where loneliness gnawed as cruelly as chains, and you begin to understand why. Records from medieval castles describe these passageways as deliberately designed to disorient. They were not simply paths from one chamber to another, but psychological weapons. The endless dripping, the repeating turns, the uniform stone all conspired to erase your sense of direction. Once inside, a prisoner no longer thought in hours or distances, but only in echoes and shadows. That, in itself, was a kind of punishment. You pause, noticing something strange. A patch of wall ahead bulges slightly, as though it were repaired hastily, or perhaps hiding a secret cavity. Some lesser-known chronicles whisper of nobles who kept hidden chambers behind dungeon walls not just for storage, but for private interrogations or secret executions far from public eyes. Whether these stories are exaggerations or rooted in truth is unclear, but the suggestion alone deepens the unease. Who knows what might have unfolded beyond that sealed stone? The soundscape grows more oppressive as you continue forward. Rats squeak, their tiny feet pattering unseen along the cracks. A gust of stale air rushes suddenly from a side passage, carrying with it the stench of rotting straw and rust. You swallow hard, because you know that smell too well already. It is the scent of despair. It lingers in every forgotten cell, long after its inhabitant has gone. There's ongoing disagreement in academic circles about just how often dungeons were used in daily medieval justice. Some historians argue they were rare, reserved for high-profile prisoners or political captives, while others claim they were grimly common, filled with nameless thieves, debtors, and rebels. The truth may lie in between, varying by region, ruler, and century. Yet when you stand here, in this imagined corridor, the debate feels irrelevant. The oppressive stone convinces you of its constant use, as though the misery never ceased. Another step forward, and your boot collides with something soft. You recoil instinctively, lowering yourself to see a damp pile of straw pressed against the wall. At first glance, it looks like bedding, though it is so thin it could never have brought warmth. You pick up a piece, noticing the mildew that has grown over it. The smell so pungent it makes your eyes water. Imagine lying here, your body already shivering, your skin pressed against straw that feels colder than stone. Chroniclers of the time mention how straw was changed rarely, sometimes only once every few months. By then, it swarmed with lice, fleas, and other crawling reminders of neglect. And yet, here is the oddest contradiction. There are scattered reports of certain dungeons where prisoners were allowed to bring personal comforts, blankets, even small fires. These were usually nobles or wealthy captives, held for ransom rather than punishment. Archaeological evidence confirms that in some castle ruins, soot stains mark the walls, proof that torches or lamps once burned steadily. It is a reminder that not all imprisonment was equal. For some, the dungeon was a waiting room until payment arrived. For others, it was a death sentence in slow motion. You press forward, deeper still. The walls close in, and you realize you can't stretch both arms without scraping stone. The air cools further, so much so that your hands feel stiff, fingers clumsy as though frostbite lurks just beyond reach. You think of prisoners chained here, unable to move, each inhale rattling in their chest while the cold stripped their strength hour by hour. Some specialists suggest that the real torment of medieval dungeons was less about physical torture devices and more about this slow, unrelenting attrition: hunger, cold, thirst, and fear. A curious superstition once held that the dungeon's chill carried curses. Folk tales told of spirits bound to these underground spaces, their misery leaking into the air like invisible smoke. Those who breathed too deeply were said to carry despair home with them, even after release. Though scholars dismiss such beliefs as myth, you can't help but notice how the air itself feels heavy with sorrow, almost as if centuries of pain remain suspended between the stones. You lean against the wall for a moment, your legs trembling. The surface is slick, your cloak soaking moisture as soon as it brushes against the rock. The drip of water continues, steady as a clock you cannot see. Time has no meaning here. Was it minutes ago you descended? Or hours? You cannot tell. In this place, the only calendar is the rhythm of your shivering. The only measure of endurance is whether your teeth still chatter. Some archaeologists speculate that prisoners scratched markings on the walls to keep track of days. Indeed, faint lines, carved crudely, have been found in several castles. Were they tallies of time or desperate prayers? Interpretations vary, but either way, those scratches prove one thing: the human mind clings to order even in chaos. And so you imagine yourself carving, one mark after another, until your hands cramp from the cold. You continue, but slowly now. The corridor branches, and you must choose left or right. Both look equally dark, equally damp, equally hostile. This is the cruelest trick: uncertainty. Which way leads deeper into torment? Which leads perhaps to a barred cell? The dungeon never reveals its secrets easily. It is not just a structure, it is a maze designed to make you feel lost, even when you are only a few yards beneath the castle. The scurrying of rats grows louder. You imagine them pausing to watch you, their beady eyes glittering faintly, accustomed to the dark in ways you will never be. They are survivors here, thriving on scraps, warmth found in fur against fur. You, however, are only passing through, and already you feel the icy grip of exhaustion closing around your chest. As you edge forward into one of the passages, the reality dawns. This is not a corridor for walking, but for waiting. The dungeon swallows sound, light, and hope alike. And while you tell yourself you are only imagining it, your body already feels the truth: this place was never meant for comfort, never meant for survival. It was built to strip away the very things that make you human. The stone presses closer, the shadows stretch longer, and the cold gnaws deeper. You keep walking because what else can you do? But the corridor offers no relief, no end in sight, only the promise that each step will feel colder than the last. Your breath clouds the air before you, ghostly shapes that linger, only a moment before the dungeon swallows them whole. The silence thickens here, broken only by the faint, irregular dripping of water striking stone. That sound becomes your constant companion, as though the dungeon is a giant clock marking time in drops instead of seconds. Each plink echoes into the void, bouncing back distorted, as though whispering in a voice not quite your own. You pause, straining to hear beyond it, and realize that there is another sound, a faint, high-pitched scurry along the floor. You are not alone. Rats dart in and out of sight, their slick fur reflecting the little light your mind still conjures. Their claws scrape over stone, quick and precise, the noise amplified in the chamber so it seems as though an army of them surrounds you. For centuries, vermin like these were constant residents of underground prisons. Medieval accounts describe them in droves, feeding off scraps of mouldy bread or gnawing directly into corpses left unattended. It was not unusual for prisoners to complain of rats biting their feet as they slept. Imagine the desperation of kicking away one creature, only for another to replace it in the dark. An odd detail preserved in monastic writings suggests that in some dungeons, guards deliberately released more vermin to heighten misery. Whether exaggeration or fact, the image is unsettling: deliberate infestation as a form of punishment. Modern researchers remain divided on whether this was widespread or rare, but even the rumor alone tells you how prisoners felt. Everything in the dungeon, even the animals, seemed enlisted against them. A stale odor rises from the corners, unmistakable once you notice it. The sour smell of rat droppings mixes with mildew and rust, and it tightens your throat as though invisible hands are squeezing. You cough, and the sound echoes grotesquely back to you. The rats pause for a heartbeat, then continue their scampering as though mocking your weakness. The straw beneath your feet crunches in odd patches, a reminder of bedding thrown here long ago. Prisoners were often given nothing more than piles of rotting straw to soften the stone, but in truth, the bedding was alive with fleas, lice, and mites. Chroniclers from France and England both note that infestations were impossible to escape. Scratching oneself raw became a nightly ritual. Those insects thrived on warmth, and in a dungeon, the only warmth to be found was human skin. Your skin. You pull your cloak tighter, but even imagination cannot keep out the crawling sensation. You shudder, half convinced something already wriggles along your arm. The dungeon becomes a test not only of endurance but of sanity. Sleep would be impossible here, every nerve stretched between shivering cold and phantom itches. Travellers' tales speak of captives driven mad by the sound of scurrying feet. One German ballad from the 14th century told of a knight who survived a year in chains, but could not bear the rats that chewed his boots and beard. Whether the story was real or metaphor, it captures a deeper truth. Survival in the dungeon was not about withstanding swords or whips, but about enduring the unending assault of small, gnawing miseries. You imagine yourself sitting in one of these corners, knees drawn up, rats darting around your feet. Their eyes gleam in the dark, catching faint light from somewhere above. They seem unafraid of you, bold even, as if confident that you are the intruder here, not them. And perhaps they are right. These vermin, after all, have survived centuries in conditions no human could tolerate. They are the true masters of this space. There's an unsettling irony. While you shiver and starve, rats thrive. Archaeological digs of castle basements have uncovered gnawed bones and rat nests woven with scraps of prisoners' clothing. In a way, the animals left behind their own historical record, written not in ink, but in chewed fabric and tiny paw prints fossilized in mud. Interpretations vary on what role these creatures played in the minds of prisoners. Some accounts treat them as tormentors, relentless and vile. Others describe them almost as companions. A lonely soul might whisper to a rat, naming it, treating its regular visits as a strange kind of company. Was this madness, or simply the human need for connection in a world stripped of all comfort? Scholars hesitate to decide, but the notion is haunting. You continue deeper, the rats scattering before you. Their squeals fade as they vanish into cracks too small for your eyes to follow. The silence that follows feels heavier than before. You realize that the vermin at least offered noise, a reminder of life. Without them, the dungeon is an empty tomb, and you are its occupant. Your boots drag now, heavy with damp. You can almost feel your toes numbing, each step more reluctant than the last. The cold has crept into your joints, stiffening your knees, and you wonder how long before your body simply refuses to continue. The prisoners of centuries past must have asked themselves the same question, staring into dark corners while their strength drained away, drip by drip, like the water that will never stop falling. You try to imagine sleep here. You close your eyes in thought, but the noises do not fade. The dripping water, the faint gnawing, the imagined scratching beneath your skin all conspire to keep you awake. Fatigue becomes its own torture. Chroniclers noted that many prisoners, after weeks or months, began to hallucinate. They saw figures in the shadows, heard voices in the stone. Was it madness? Or was it simply the dungeon itself, alive and whispering through their weakened minds? A curious superstition held that rats were omens. If they gathered close to a prisoner, it meant death would soon follow. If they scattered away, it meant release might come. Guards sometimes mocked captives by tossing crumbs and watching how quickly the vermin responded. The cruelty lay not only in the gesture, but in the false hope it might create. Hope, in this place, was the sharpest weapon of all. You glance upward, though the ceiling is lost in shadow. Somewhere above, life continues. Fires crackle, voices chatter, bread bakes. Down here, though, your world has shrunk to the size of your own shivering body. The scrape of claws, the drip of water. You cannot tell if an hour has passed or only minutes. Time bends, stretches, coils like smoke. And so, as you sit against the damp wall, rats darting nearby, you begin to realize the truth. The dungeon does not need elaborate tortures. It has its own arsenal: cold, darkness, vermin, hunger, loneliness. These are weapons sharper than any blade, slower than poison, yet more inevitable. They carve away at you one heartbeat at a time. You thought at first that the descent was the worst. But no, the true torment lies here, in the company of creatures that thrive on scraps, in the endless chorus of dripping water and scratching claws. This is where you understand that one night in a medieval dungeon would stretch endlessly, because the hours themselves refuse to end. And even now, with your cloak pulled tight and your imagination struggling to shield you, the dungeon wins. It always wins. You reach another stretch of corridor, and here the air seems to grow colder still, though you had not thought such a thing possible. The stones under your fingertips are damp, slick, and rimmed with crystals of salt leaching from the walls. The further you move into this place, the more you feel as though warmth has been erased, not just from the chamber, but from the very memory of your body. Each breath aches, expanding in your chest as if frozen glass were lodged inside. Then your eyes adjust to the faint gleam ahead. Chains, fixed firmly into the wall. They dangle limply, heavy rings of iron tipped with cuffs designed to clasp wrists or ankles. The metal is blackened with rust, flakes dropping at the slightest movement. Yet you can tell how strong they once were. Even in decay, the iron radiates menace. You can imagine the sound they once made, an iron bite snapping closed around bone, echoing through stone like a cruel announcement. Prison registers from English castles in the 14th century mention shackles specifically measured to fit certain prisoners. They were not one-size-fits-all tools, but tailored restraints, as personal as a set of keys. That detail alone chills you, suggesting not only punishment, but meticulous planning, as though each captive's misery was carefully designed. And there, carved into the wall just beside the manacle, are Scratch's letters, crude and jagged. You run your hand across them, tracing what might be a name. Some prisoners left marks in stone, desperate attempts to prove they had once been here. Archaeologists have documented such carvings in the dungeons beneath Prague and the castles of Scotland. Sometimes they are simple initials, other times prayers, and occasionally drawings a cross, a bird, a face. They were gestures of resistance, fragments of humanity scratched against stone. You lean closer, and for a moment you think you see fresh scratches, as though someone was just here, their fingernails dragging along the wall. Your mind plays tricks, but then again, that is what the dungeon was designed to do. Without clocks, without sunlight, prisoners lost track of themselves. Modern researchers suggest that hallucinations were inevitable in such spaces, where deprivation worked more powerfully than any whip. And then you notice something peculiar. The cuffs are cold, yes, but colder than the surrounding air, as if the iron itself traps frost more efficiently than stone. Prisoners would have felt that cold as a burn on their skin. Some accounts even note that shackled men emerged with wrists blackened, not by blows, but by frostbite. It was not necessary to whip or strike. The dungeon's temperature, coupled with unmoving iron, carried out the punishment silently. An unusual account from a Florentine chronicle describes a prisoner who rubbed his manacles so often that the iron grew polished, gleaming like a mirror. Imagine the hours he must have spent, turning them back and forth, desperate for movement. Such small rituals became lifelines, though their futility was absolute. Specialists remain divided on whether manacles were standard in most dungeons or if they were reserved for those deemed particularly dangerous. Some evidence suggests that many captives were left unchained, the stone walls themselves sufficient to imprison them. But for high-value targets, rebels, nobles, spies, the iron was a guarantee of immobility. In either case, the mere presence of chains transforms this space into something more terrifying. You shiver at the thought of your own wrists caught there, unable to move, forced to sit as cold air licked at your skin. The atmosphere is heavy, and your ears prick at a faint metallic hum. You realize it's only your imagination, the echo of the chains swaying gently, but it sounds like the lingering vibration of suffering, and in that sound you hear stories untold. How many people rattled these same rings, tugging with hopeless strength? How many collapsed into silence when the iron refused to yield? And here comes a peculiar superstition once held by guards. They believed that chains could absorb souls. A man who died in shackles left part of his spirit in the iron, so the next prisoner would feel his despair. Guards sometimes tapped the manacles with their swords, claiming they could hear whispers trapped within. Of course, no evidence proves such claims, but the image is haunting iron as both jailer and coffin, carrying grief across centuries. You imagine the weight of those cuffs closing around your wrists. The cold would bite instantly, deeper with each passing minute. Circulation would falter. Fingers would stiffen, swell, and darken. There would be no escape, no comfort in shifting, no ability even to rub your hands together for warmth. The chains were not simply restraints, they were instruments of time itself, ensuring that hours felt like days, and nights stretched into eternity. A faint drip echoes again, louder here. You glance upward to see moisture trickling along the stone, running down directly over the iron rings. The water carries minerals, staining both wall and chain with pale streaks. You realize that in winter, this water would freeze, locking the cuffs in place, tightening around the prisoner's skin until flesh adhered to frost. Imagine pulling away and leaving part of yourself behind. Medieval manuscripts occasionally mention cold irons as punishment, and now you understand. Not heated branding irons, but frozen shackles, biting without flame. Pain delivered by absence of heat, by subtraction rather than addition. The cruelty lay in its simplicity. And yet, curiously, some nobles taken captive were not shackled at all. They were housed in tower chambers, given food, warmth, even writing materials. The contrast is sharp. For the wealthy, captivity could be almost comfortable. For the poor, it was degradation by stone and chain. The dungeon was as much a mirror of social hierarchy as the banquet hall above. You step back, your hand brushing the iron unintentionally. It chills you to the core, and you imagine, just for a moment, that it remembers every wrist it ever bound. You shake your head, telling yourself it's just rust, just metal. Yet the feeling lingers, as if history itself clings to your skin. And then comes the silence. No drip, no scurry, no hum of chain, only the sound of your own pulse pounding in your ears. You realize how fragile warmth is, how quickly it can be stripped away, how deeply the absence of comfort can wound. The dungeon did not need fire or blade. Its tools were simpler: iron, stone, and time. You continue walking, though the chains remain behind, swaying faintly in the unseen draught. Their clink fades into distance, but you know they will echo in your mind long after. Every step you take further into the dungeon reminds you, even freedom, imagined as it is, does not shake off the weight of iron once felt. And so you press forward, deeper still, carrying with you the memory of shackles, the bite of frozen metal, and the whisper of souls said to linger in rust. The corridor narrows until you can no longer stretch out both arms without scraping stone. Here, light dies completely. Even if a torch burned nearby, the air is so thick with damp that the flame would choke on its own smoke. You squint into the black and realize that the only illumination comes from your own imagination, the glimmer of moisture sliding down walls, the faint reflection of your breath as it curls away into nothingness. You strain to see, but sight is not the sense that rules this chamber. Sound dominates now. Somewhere behind you, a drip resumes, steady and insistent. To your right, a faint scratch, something small dragging claws over stone. Ahead, silence so profound that your own heart becomes a drumbeat, pounding in your ears. You whisper just to prove you still have a voice, and the echo returns distorted, carrying tones you never spoke. In this way, the dungeon plays tricks, convincing you that voices linger where none exist. Medieval chroniclers often noted the importance of light or its absence in punishment. Captivity without sun or flame was considered a torment in itself. Records from Paris in the 13th century describe oubliettes, shafts that dropped prisoners into pitch blackness, leaving them to vanish from memory. The name itself means to forget. Standing here in your own imagined darkness, you understand how effective such a method could be. It is not chains or guards that defeat you, but the suffocating erasure of the world beyond. You run a hand along the wall, guiding yourself forward, but it is slick with moss, cold enough that your fingers ache instantly. The surface undulates, as if stones have swollen with centuries of damp. Your sense of direction falters, because every step feels identical. Every sound repeats in endless refrain. Some researchers believe dungeon design was not deliberate cruelty but simple practicality, basements for storage later reused for captives. Yet others argue that the oppressive architecture was intentional, meant to sap orientation and morale. The debate continues, but in this moment, trapped in blackness, intent hardly matters. The effect is undeniable. A curious detail emerges in certain castle inventories. Torches were rarely issued for prisoners. Guards carried light, but captives were left in darkness unless they smuggled in candles. When archaeologists find hardened drips of wax along dungeon walls, they treat it as evidence of human desperation. A prisoner clutching a stub of flame, watching it shrink, knowing that once it died, so too would their sense of reality. Imagine huddling here with that fragile glow, staring at the rough surface until it seemed to shift and breathe with each flicker. You inhale, and the damp air burns your lungs with its chill. It carries a metallic tang, unmistakable, as though rust has been ground into dust and scattered into every breath. That taste is joined by mold, pungent and earthy, forcing its way into your throat until you gag. The darkness seems to magnify smell, heightening your awareness of every rot and stain. In such conditions, disease thrived. Records from German fortresses describe outbreaks of fever among prisoners confined underground, spreading quickly through shared air and fouled water. Was it the rats, the mold, or the sheer lack of sanitation? Experts disagree, but the result was the same. Sickness became another jailer. You pause again, ears straining. For a moment, you think you hear a whisper. Perhaps it is only your own breath curling back to you, reshaped by echo. Perhaps it is memory, pulling tricks. Yet you recall how some medieval prisoners swore they heard voices of saints or devils in the dark. Monks wrote of captives who claimed angels guided them, while others shrieked of demons crawling across their skin. Modern scholars suggest hallucinations born of deprivation, but the prisoners themselves believed otherwise. For them, the darkness was alive. Your hand brushes something unexpected wood, rough and splintering. You trace its outline, a door, narrow and warped by damp, its hinges groan faintly when touched. Behind it may be a chamber, a cell, perhaps another abyss. For a moment you hesitate. The silence presses close, as though waiting to see if you dare. You push lightly, and the wood shudders, releasing a gust of air colder than before. It smells of rot and stagnant water, with an undertone of something sweet and foul. You realize quickly what that scent signifies: decay. Prison accounts describe cells where straw and bodies rotted together until the difference was barely discernible. Guards rarely cleaned, preferring to let filth accumulate as another layer of punishment. Archaeological digs in certain sites confirm this. Layers of organic matter compacted over centuries, bones hidden among refuse. To step through this door is to step into that reality, a place where life and death mingle in damp silence. You withdraw your hand, heart pounding. In the pitch dark, every choice feels irreversible. You continue forward instead, letting the door remain closed, though its memory clings to you. The unseen becomes more terrifying than the seen. And then comes the most subtle torment, the feeling of air moving across your skin. It is slight, barely perceptible, but unmistakably cold. A draught slips through cracks, winding its way through the passage. In an above-ground hall, such air might feel refreshing. Here, it cuts like a blade, carrying chill deeper into your bones. Imagine lying chained in a corner, the draft streaming across your body hour after hour, denying even the warmth of your own breath. Chroniclers wrote of captives who shivered themselves into exhaustion, their muscles spasming uncontrollably. Some died not of wounds, but of sheer exposure. Travellers' anecdotes add another layer. One Venetian visitor to a northern castle claimed he heard prisoners coughing endlessly in the night, the sound echoing upward through stone shafts. He described it as a chorus of the frozen. Whether truth or embellishment, the phrase captures perfectly what you sense here. The dungeon as a vast throat, amplifying suffering until it becomes music of its own. You close your eyes, though it makes no difference. The blackness is absolute. You try to imagine a morning sun, but the thought feels absurd. Time has slipped away entirely. Without light, you cannot measure hours. Without sound, you cannot mark moments. This is how the dungeon strips identity, it severs you from rhythm itself. Archaeological evidence from certain sites reveals grooves worn into walls where prisoners repeatedly rubbed the same spot. Perhaps they were measuring time, perhaps simply reminding themselves they still existed. That, in its own way, is the most tragic truth. To endure the dark, one needed proof of one's own presence. You touch the wall now, pressing your palm flat, leaving moisture behind as your offering. The silence deepens again. Rats vanish, water pauses, even your heartbeat seems subdued. And in that stillness you realize the dungeon has no need to shout its cruelty. Darkness itself is enough. It erases color, erases distance, erases hope. It leaves only the cold and the certainty that one night here could stretch into eternity. You inhale again, tasting rust and mold, listening to echoes that are not yours. You move forward, though you know the corridor has no true end. The dungeon will always extend one step further than your strength. And as you walk, you understand why no one lasts a night here, not because of torture devices or violent guards, but because the silence, the blackness, the unseen draft gnaw away at the very idea of survival. The torch you once imagined is long gone. Now, only the dark remains, heavy as stone, endless as despair. The flickering torch you once imagined sputters out altogether now, leaving you in complete shadow. The silence feels swollen, almost physical, pressing into your ears until you can hear the faintest scratch of your own skin against your sleeve. You stand still, and for a moment you begin to think that even stillness is a mistake, because in stillness, the dungeon reveals another of its cruel companions. Smell. The stench creeps into your nose slowly, as if it wants you to notice each layer. First, the sour tang of damp earth, sharp and metallic. Then the unmistakable bite of mold, heavy and spore-thick, clinging to your throat as though trying to root itself there. Beneath it all lurks something more repulsive, an odor that combines mildew with sweat and rot. You flinch, because you recognize it instinctively. It is the scent of straw that has not been changed for weeks, soaked with human waste, left to ferment in its own misery. Chroniclers of the 14th century often wrote with horror about the condition of dungeon bedding. They describe how straw would be tossed in at the start of imprisonment and left untouched until it dissolved into black sludge. A captive might sleep on the same heap for months, coughing on spores, scratching at lice, inhaling the pungent cloud of their own body's decline. Even if you lay down exhausted, there would be no rest here, only restless twitching, every breath a battle against stench. And yet, curiously, inventories from some castles show records of straw being refreshed twice a year. Refreshed, such a polite word, when what it meant was tossing another layer of dry stalks on top of rotting piles. Archaeologists examining compacted dungeon floors have uncovered layers of straw preserved like strata of earth, each one pressed flat by human weight. To look at them now is to read a geological map of suffering. You crouch low and touch the ground. The texture is coarse, scratchy against your fingertips, but also damp, clumped together in matted knots. It leaves a bitter smell on your skin, and you wipe your hand quickly against your cloak. You imagine lying here, your cheek pressed into the rank straw, every breath a reminder of how far you've fallen from comfort. Even the idea of a wooden pallet feels like luxury compared to this heap. One obscure account from a Spanish prisoner mentions how straw could come alive at night, not through magic but because of the insects nesting within it. Fleas, bedbugs, and lice turned bedding into a crawling colony. Some prisoners, he wrote, would shake their straw desperately each evening, only to find it infested again within hours. The account may exaggerate, but entomologists who have examined ancient sites confirm the plausibility. Fleas thrived in the damp, feeding not just on men, but on rats and each other. Specialists in medieval health remain divided on whether such infestations were tolerated by design or ignored out of laziness. Some suggest guards preferred to keep prisoners weak, their energy drained by scratching and illness. Others argue that hygiene was simply irrelevant in a system built on neglect. Either way, you know what it feels like. As you lie in this imagined straw, you can already feel phantom itches, the creeping crawl of tiny legs across your skin. The odor deepens as your nose adjusts. You detect another layer now, faint but unmistakable, the metallic tang of blood. Perhaps it is only rust on iron, perhaps only your imagination sharpened by fear. Yet medieval testimony makes clear that straw often carried stains of violence, nosebleeds, cuts, and worse. In such places, even the bedding remembered suffering. You think again of the castle above. Picture the great hall, filled with roasted meats, spices, and sweet wine. Those smells drift upward, comforting, while here below, only mildew and filth remain. The contrast is brutal and entirely deliberate. Feasts above reinforced the hierarchy, while starvation and rot below reminded captives of their place. This duality defined medieval castles. Pageantry above, despair below. You try breathing shallowly, hoping to avoid the worst of the stench. But shallow breaths are no escape. The air itself is saturated. Monastic visitors who recorded dungeon conditions often wrote of nausea overwhelming them after just a few minutes. Imagine then what it meant to spend days, weeks, or months here. Some prisoners, weakened by hunger, collapsed directly onto the foul straw and never rose again. And still, curiously, there are stories of defiance. Scratched poems survive from a prisoner in Venice, who wrote of imagining fields of fresh hay while lying in a cell of rot. His words describe the mental trick of replacing foul odor with the memory of summer. Whether this was survival strategy or madness is unclear, but it reveals the strength of human imagination, even in darkness. You lean your head back, pressing against the wall, trying the same trick. You picture a meadow, golden stalks swaying under sunlight, the sweet perfume of cut grass carried on wind. For a moment, you almost believe it. But then a rat darts across your foot, and the illusion shatters. The real smell returns, heavy and inescapable, reminding you where you are. Travelers' anecdotes hint at another cruelty. Guards themselves often mocked captives by tossing spoiled straw into cells, laughing at the coughing and sneezing it provoked. Some even urinated on the heaps before delivery. These stories may be exaggerated, colored by hatred for oppressors, but the sheer number of them suggests truth beneath. Your throat tightens, and you realize that the dungeon is not only cold but suffocating. The stench clings inside you, a weight on your lungs, as though the very air conspires against survival. You cough again, the sound echoing grotesquely. It startles a cluster of bats from somewhere high above, their wings beating in frantic escape. Even they prefer the open night sky to this fetid hollow. You try to imagine how long you could endure such conditions. Hours? Perhaps. A single night? Maybe. Weeks? Impossible. The thought alone exhausts you. You see now why so many records mention death, not by blade or rope, but by attrition. The dungeon itself was executioner, working with cold, darkness, and stench. And yet, a strange thought creeps in. Could the stench, unbearable at first, eventually become background noise? Could the body adapt, dulled by constant exposure. Some prisoners might have endured by letting their senses numb, their minds drifting elsewhere. But would that be survival or surrender? The debate among historians continues. Was dungeon imprisonment meant primarily to punish or simply to hold? Some argue that decay and filth were unintended byproducts, exaggerated in later retellings. Others insist the cruelty was calculated, a tool to crush spirit without lifting a whip. The truth may never be settled, but standing here in your imagination, the filth feels deliberate. It feels like design. You press forward again, though your stomach churns, though the odor coats your tongue like slime. You leave the straw behind, yet the memory clings, stronger than any chain. For now you understand the cruelest trick of the dungeon. Its smells do not stay in stone. They seep into your skin, your hair, your very breath. And even when you leave, they follow. So you walk on, through darkness thick with mildew, carrying the foul reminder that comfort is a foreign world. Above you, kitchens fill with spice and smoke. Down here, the only fragrance is despair. You shuffle forward, every step reluctant, and the straw stench lingers in your nostrils like a curse. Your boots drag across stone that feels colder now, almost slick with condensation, and you pause as your joints begin to ache. The chill has worked its way into your bones, and even imagining movement requires effort. Your fingers clench and unclench, stiff, sluggish, as though you were already half frozen. You press your hands against your chest, trying to summon warmth, but the air snatches it away before it can settle. It is here, in the raw silence of the dungeon, that your body reminds you what cold truly does. It isn't just discomfort, it gnaws. First at the fingertips, then the toes, then the knees. Blood retreats inward, leaving extremities numb and clumsy. The sensation is not unlike thousands of tiny needles pricking at your skin. The prisoners who once huddled here knew this intimately, describing in their own words how the frost bites more keenly than iron, a chilling phrase, quite literally. Records from northern castles confirm that many dungeons lacked fires altogether. Even in bitter winters, guards had no reason to waste fuel below ground. After all, the cold itself served as punishment. Accounts survive of captives begging for scraps of cloth, pleading for permission to keep their shoes, only to be denied. Some were forced barefoot onto wet stone, where frost settled like a second chain. You can feel it yourself as you stand here, your toes curling inside your boots, desperate for insulation that does not exist. One peculiar note appears in a 15th century ledger from Germany. Prisoners sometimes attempted to warm themselves by stomping in place, beating arms against chest. The guards mocked this dance of the damned, imitating the motions in jest. The detail may sound comical from a distance of centuries, but picture it here, the desperate flailing of limbs, not for humor, but for survival. You imagine yourself trying the same, only to exhaust your muscles before any real warmth arrives. Modern researchers remain divided on how quickly cold exposure could kill. Some argue that dampness accelerated the process, causing hypothermia in hours rather than days. Others believe starvation was the greater danger, with cold acting as an accomplice rather than executioner. But the debate feels academic when your skin already tingles, your jaw already trembles with involuntary chatter. If your body cannot rest, cannot sleep, then every passing hour is punishment enough. And still, curiously, there are accounts of resilience. A French knight imprisoned in the early 1300 seconds boasted that he survived winter by sheer force of will, huddling in meditation to control his breath. Whether true or bravado, the story suggests that mind over body became the last weapon. You wonder if you could do the same, slowing breath, tightening focus, retreating into imagination. Yet each gust of icy air breaks concentration, dragging you back to the ache in your bones. You glance upward, and a faint draft slithers through cracks in the ceiling. It is invisible, but you feel it unmistakably against your skin. The draft doesn't soothe, it slices. The way cold air moves here is different than in the open, it has weight. pressing into your clothes, insinuating itself between skin and fabric. Imagine lying chained in this very spot, with that draft playing across your body all night long, robbing you of warmth molecule by molecule. The prisoners who endured this often shivered themselves into exhaustion, their muscles seizing until fatigue drowned them. Some fell silent and never rose again. A peculiar belief once circulated among common folk: that dungeon cold carried curses. Villagers warned that a man who spent a night underground would emerge hollowed, his spirit partly frozen away. Perhaps it was superstition, perhaps an attempt to explain why former captives often appeared gaunt and trembling. Yet there is something to the image of a soul chipped away, frostbite not only on skin but on essence. The silence deepens. Your teeth knock together with a rhythm beyond your control. You try to clench your jaw, but the vibration continues. It becomes an echo, as though the dungeon itself mocks you with your own trembling. Chroniclers noted how prisoners often bit their tongues in attempts to stop the noise, only to bleed into straw already soaked with filth. The absurdity of fighting your own body becomes clear. You are not only captive to stone and chain, but captive to shiver itself. Archaeological evidence confirms that frost did more than discomfort. In some excavated sites, bones show signs of arthritis far beyond a captive's age, likely accelerated by constant damp chill. Imagine the ache spreading into every joint, until movement itself became torment. And worse, there was no respite, no fire to stretch beside, no blanket to cocoon in, only stone, straw, and your own breath fogging into nothingness. You wrap your cloak tighter, though you know it does nothing. The air seeps through, relentless. Each inhale burns, each exhale fades instantly. You remember the hall above, where nobles wore fur-lined garments, their hearths blazing through winter nights. Down here, furs are unimaginable luxuries. Down here, even wool would feel like a miracle. A curious superstition tells of prisoners who believed frost carried voices. In some legends, the icy draught whispered secrets, sometimes of escape, sometimes of doom. One Italian account even insists a captive learned the hour of his execution from the breath of the wall. Scholars dismiss this as imagination warped by deprivation. Yet when you stand here, feeling air hiss through cracks, it is easy to believe in voices. Your mind shapes the draught into whispers, and you strain to interpret their meaning. You press onward, knees aching, muscles stiff. The dungeon narrows again, and suddenly you stumble, catching yourself on the wall. The stone bites your palm with its chill, leaving a damp imprint on your skin. You glance down and realize your breath has quickened, ragged from both cold and fear. Each heartbeat feels louder than footsteps. The dungeon has slowed you, trapped you not with chains but with the weariness that frost breeds. Travelers' records from the Low Countries speak of prisoners found sitting upright, their eyes open, their faces serene. Death by cold was often quiet, the body shutting down slowly, almost gently. Unlike torture with blades or fire, exposure carried no screams, only silence, as warmth slipped away unnoticed. And here, surrounded by endless damp stone, you realize that this is precisely why no one would last a night. The dungeon does not strike suddenly. It erodes. It hollows. You pause to rub your arms, generating a fraction of heat, though the movement feels futile. You wonder how long until the body surrenders. Hours? Perhaps? A single night? Likely not. And yet, the dungeon has patience. It does not hurry. It watches as each shiver grows weaker, each breath shorter, until your body becomes still. The cold is not just a sensation here, it is a companion. It walks with you, sits with you, breathes with you. It does not need permission, and it never leaves. And so you continue, step by step, wrapped in air that bites, carrying with you the knowledge that warmth is a memory, not a promise. Above, fires blaze. Here, frost reigns, and you are its subject. The ache in your hands deepens until you feel as though your bones themselves have hollowed out. Your knuckles throb when you curl them, and your knees tremble with every step. The dungeon does not simply chill you, it gnaws, steady and patient, stripping away strength as if peeling bark from a tree. And into that cold creeps another hunger, one more insistent than the rest. Your stomach growls, startling in the silence, and you remember that warmth alone is not survival. You need food. The meager rations of medieval imprisonment are well documented, though their exact form varied wildly. In some records from England, a prisoner might receive nothing more than a crust of black bread each day, sometimes dipped into a weak broth. In others, accounts describe buckets lowered, with mouldy scraps left over from the great hall above. It was rarely sustenance, it was merely enough to prolong misery. And in some cases, captives were left with nothing, expected to beg families for deliveries, or simply starve. Imagine the crust itself, hard as stone, edges curling with staleness. You bite down, your teeth aching at the resistance, the bread tasting more of ash than grain. Sometimes it was deliberately salted, meant to inflame thirst without offering water. Sometimes it was barely baked, the dough gummy and sour, fermenting inside before you even swallowed. Yet when you are desperate, each mouthful feels like both curse and blessing. One peculiar anecdote comes from the 15th century. A Burgundian prisoner wrote that he received bread so infested with insects that he picked out beetles before eating. Yet after days of starvation, he began to eat them too, discovering they added a strange crunch. The detail lingers because it feels grotesque, and yet, in the dungeon's silence, you understand how the line between disgust and survival thins rapidly. Specialists in medieval diet remain uncertain whether starvation was a deliberate policy or the result of logistical neglect. Some argue that feeding captives was an unwanted expense, so hunger itself became part of punishment. Others note that in certain castles, prisoners of rank were provided with meals befitting their status: cheese, meat, wine, even spices. But for the nameless poor, the rations were humiliating, barely edible, and sometimes poisoned with rot. Whatever the motive, the effect was the same: bodies weakened, spirits broke, nights lengthened into unbearable ordeals. You crouch in your imagination now, your stomach folding in on itself. The thought of bread tempts, but so does the memory of what food should be: warm stews, roasted meats, the comfort of butter melting on fresh loaves. That contrast feels like cruelty in itself. Above you, nobles feast, tossing bones to their dogs, while below, you gnaw on crumbs that barely qualify as food. Water, too, becomes its own torment. In some dungeons, captives drank directly from trickles down the wall, catching drips on their tongues. Archaeological surveys reveal mineral stains around these seepage points, evidence of centuries of use. But such water carried risk. It could be fouled by waste above, or riddled with disease. Prisoners knew this, yet thirst made caution irrelevant. You imagine yourself pressing lips to damp stone, licking slime as though it were spring water. The humiliation stings worse than chains. A curious belief recorded in Italian chronicles tells of prisoners who claimed that hunger sharpened visions. They saw saints, devils, or glimpses of paradise in the dark. Some swore the visions gave them strength, others admitted they were maddened by phantoms. Modern researchers debate whether these were religious ecstasies or hallucinations from malnutrition. In either case, hunger transformed the dungeon into a theatre of the mind, where the boundary between real and imagined dissolved. You reach another chamber, low-ceilinged, the air thick with damp straw and mildew. Scattered across the floor are bowls, cracked and empty. Their rims are stained with grease, as though once filled with broth so thin it barely left residue. You lift one and smell only rot. These relics remind you that prisoners here lived not on meals but on mockeries of meals. The bowls are echoes of sustenance, mocking in their emptiness. And yet, there were exceptions. Accounts survive of wealthy captives bribing guards for better fare. A duke might dine on roasted fowl smuggled into his cell, his misery softened by luxury. One prisoner in Scotland reportedly ordered wine from Bordeaux, his ransom-paying family eager to keep him alive in comfort. The inequity is staggering. The same dungeon could host both starvation and indulgence, side by side, depending on wealth. You think of your own hunger now, curling sharp and insistent inside you. Could you survive a night without food? Certainly. But here, hunger is not only physical, it is symbolic. It tells you that the world above no longer cares whether you eat. Hunger is a message, carved into your ribs. You are forgotten. Archaeologists studying human remains from castle pits often note signs of malnutrition, bones thinned, teeth worn by gritty bread. These are quiet testimonies, the final records of bodies slowly drained of vitality. The stones may not speak, but the skeletons tell their story. Lives wasted not by violence but by emptiness. The silence of the dungeon makes hunger louder. Your stomach growls again, and the echo multiplies, filling the chamber as though a dozen bellies starve beside you. You almost laugh, because the sound feels absurdly alive, and then you fall silent, because you realize how quickly that noise will fade once weakness overtakes you. A curious superstition among guards suggested that starving prisoners grew more dangerous, not less. They believed hunger gave men wild strength, a final surge of desperation. Some even withheld food until the eve of execution, fearing a ravenous captive might attack. Whether superstition or rare truth, the belief reveals something important. Hunger was never neutral. It was both punishment and weapon, shaping bodies and minds alike. You picture yourself now, clutching a crust of bread. The texture scratches your mouth, the taste bitter, yet you force it down. It sits like a stone in your stomach, insufficient but better than nothing. And you wonder how many prisoners whispered silent thanks for such crumbs, even as they knew it prolonged suffering. Gratitude twisted into irony, the dungeon's cruelest feast. Your body grows weaker with each imagined step, and hunger gnaws in rhythm with cold. Together they form a duet, frost tightening your joints, emptiness hollowing your belly. No blade is needed, no execution awaits. Survival itself becomes a question mark hanging in the air. You move forward, leaving the bowls behind, their grease stains glowing faintly in the dark like ghosts of forgotten meals. The smell of mold follows, but now your senses are dulled. Hunger numbs as surely as cold, and you begin to wonder, if you survive this night, will you ever taste food the same way again? Above, the feasts continue. Below you chew on shadows, and the dungeon, patient as always, waits to see which will consume you first, frost or famine. The echo of your hunger fades, only to be replaced by another thirst you cannot escape. Your lips crack as if the dungeon itself has stolen moisture from them. Each swallow scrapes your throat like sand, and you realize water, something so simple, so ordinary above, is here transformed into treasure. You scan the walls and notice the faint gleam of moisture where stone bleeds in slow trickles. You reach out, pressing your palm flat, and feel the chill of water seeping through hairline cracks. You lower your head, pressing lips against stone, licking droplets as though they were nectar. The taste is bitter, metallic, infused with earth and minerals. Yet even this meager drink feels like a blessing. Prison inventories from several English castles note that water was rarely rationed in neat cups. Instead, captives relied on seepage or buckets lowered carelessly into their cells. Sometimes those buckets contained more filth than liquid. There are accounts of men scooping water from the same floor where they relieved themselves. Desperation stronger than disgust. Imagine the humiliation, thirst clawing so fiercely that you bend to drink from puddles darkened by your own body's waste. One unsettling account from the dungeons of Naples describes how prisoners fought over dripping walls, each claiming a corner as their own. They lay beneath trickles with open mouths, as if worshipping the stone itself. The chronicler wrote with disgust, but you can understand their desperation here in the silence. where every drop seems louder than your heartbeat. Specialists in medieval history still debate whether dungeons were deliberately deprived of clean water or if filth was an inevitable byproduct of poor design. Some argue that castles were built with rudimentary drainage systems, meaning water often carried waste into the lowest chambers. Others believe deprivation itself was intentional. Thirst as punishment, thirst as torture, without the need for chains. You crouch lower now, trailing fingers along a rivulet that snakes down the wall. It pools briefly at the base, shimmering faintly in torchless dark, before sinking into cracks. You imagine cupping hands, scooping precious drops, only to spill half before reaching your lips. How many prisoners wasted their final strength trying to catch water that refused to be caught? A peculiar superstition once circulated among jailers. They said dungeon water carried madness. They warned that captives who drank too deeply from wall seepage would hear voices afterward, spirits of those who had died here. Perhaps it was nothing more than infection or parasite. Still, the image lingers. Each swallow a communion with ghosts. Archaeologists excavating ancient cells occasionally uncover stone basins carved into corners, primitive attempts at collecting runoff. Their edges are worn smooth, evidence of countless hands scraping to gather every last drop. These basins tell a story written not in ink but in thirst, carved by desperation across centuries. You lift your head and realize that thirst is not just physical, it becomes sound. The dripping water taunts, echoing through corridors with deliberate cruelty. It falls irregularly, so you cannot time it, cannot prepare. Sometimes 2 drops follow quickly, and your heart leaps with hope, then nothing for long moments, stretching into eternity. Each pause becomes a joke at your expense, as though the dungeon enjoys dangling relief just beyond reach. And then the memory of above presses in again. You think of goblets filled with ale, wine poured freely into silver cups. You think of fountains in noble courtyards, spilling water casually for decoration. Up there, water is wasted in abundance. Down here, you would trade your freedom for a single clear draught. The disparity is staggering, the cruelty sharpened by contrast. You lean back against stone, your throat raw, your tongue swollen. You imagine a bucket lowered by a rope, wood dripping, iron handle clanking. You imagine rushing forward only to find brackish liquid crawling with insects. Would you hesitate? Or would you plunge hands in, drinking greedily despite bile rising in your throat? Centuries of testimony suggest you would drink. You always drink. One curious traveller wrote that he watched a prisoner lick condensation from the iron bars of his own cell. The sight shocked him not because it was vile, but because of the fervour, the worshipful devotion to droplets so small they barely existed. He wrote, "In that moment, iron became his chalice, and rust his sacrament." You can picture it clearly, and the image unsettles you more than whips or racks ever could. Scholars remain divided on which deprivation, hunger, or thirst was worse. Starvation wastes slowly, but thirst arrives swiftly, twisting body and mind alike. Some argue thirst was more effective as punishment, because madness often followed within days. Whatever the conclusion, here in this imagined dungeon, thirst is your master. You press your lips once more to stone, licking moisture greedily. The taste is foul, but your body begs regardless. For a moment, relief trickles through you. Then the ache returns, stronger than before. Thirst is not quenched by sips, it grows, like a fire fed by its own smoke. And now you understand why no one lasts a night here. It is not only the cold, not only the hunger, but the thirst, constant and mocking. Each drop reminds you of life outside, of rivers running free, of cups lifted in joy. Each drop reminds you of what you no longer have. Your stomach knots, your throat burns, your head throbs from dehydration. The dungeon tilts around you, shadows spinning like phantoms. You stumble forward, guided by instinct rather than sight, chasing the sound of another drip that may or may not exist. Above, nobles sip wine in comfort. Below, you lick stone and call it survival. The cruelty is complete, not because you are beaten, but because you are made to crave the most basic gift, water, and in craving, you lose yourself. The dungeon does not need chains to bind you. It binds you with thirst, drop by drop, until you are nothing more than hollow skin waiting for the next echo. You stumble onward, lips cracked, body trembling, and for a moment you almost welcome the silence. But then the silence betrays you again. It sharpens, hones itself, until the faintest sound cuts through like a blade. You freeze, straining your ears. At first, you think it is the dripping water again, but no, the rhythm is different. Louder, sharper. It is a scream. It arrives faint at first, as though carried down a long stone throat. Then it swells, echoing off walls, splitting into layers of pain that overlap like a chorus. You cannot tell whether it is near or far, male or female. The dungeon's architecture transforms a single voice into dozens, surrounding you. You hold your breath, waiting, your chest tightening with dread. Contemporary accounts describe this phenomenon vividly. Stone chambers amplified every cry, so that one prisoner's agony became a haunting soundtrack for all others. In some castles, the design was intentional punishment as theatre. Records from France suggest that guards paraded prisoners past cells so others could hear their suffering. Was it practical or cruel? The debate continues. But here underground, you realize intent hardly matters. The effect is devastating. The scream twists into sobs, then fades, leaving a hollow silence more terrible than the noise itself. You realize how much worse absence feels. Without cries, your mind invents them. You hear whispers that are not there, voices rising and falling in your own head. Chroniclers noted this too. Captives claimed to hear companions who had died long ago, their voices drifting as though alive. Scholars today attribute this to stress and deprivation. But standing here, the explanation feels too simple. One odd anecdote comes from the Bastille in Paris. Prisoners insisted that the walls themselves moaned, as though stones retained echoes of torment. They pressed ears against cold blocks, swearing they could hear chains rattling from centuries past. Archaeologists can confirm that sound does travel strangely through damp masonry, creating phantom noises. But still imagine lying awake, certain that the wall is whispering to you, replaying sufferings you never witnessed. You crouch low, trying to steady yourself. The silence thickens again, only to be broken by another sound, the faint rattle of chains. This time it is not yours. Somewhere in the distance, iron scrapes against stone, perhaps a guard dragging shackles, perhaps a prisoner shifting in sleep. You cannot know. What you do know is that you are not alone. Travelers' tales from the 14th century describe how prisoners clung to these sounds as proof of company. One man wrote that he counted each rattle as comfort, proof that another human still breathed nearby. Others dreaded the noises, hearing in them a reminder of endless captivity. Both are true for you now. Relief and terror mingled, as the sound confirms both companionship and despair. The air grows heavy again, pressing into your ears until every echo magnifies. You begin to hear patterns in the drips, shapes in the rattles, as though the dungeon itself composes a song. It is a song of suffering, with verses written in moans and refrains in silence. You realize that one night here would not be silent at all. It would be an endless concert, blending fear, imagination, and despair into something you cannot escape. Specialists in medieval penal history often argue about whether torture devices were frequently used. Some suggest the idea of constant torture is exaggerated by later writers seeking drama. Others insist that screams heard in dungeons were real, not imagined, carried down corridors as deliberate warning. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but either way, for a captive in the dark, perception is reality. If you hear screams, then you live inside their shadow. You move forward, unsteady, and your foot scuffs against something metallic. You crouch again and discover a rusted ring bolt embedded in the floor. Beside it lies a scrap of fabric, rotted almost to nothing. You pick it up, and for a moment, you swear you smell sweat, faint but real, preserved by damp. This is the ghost of a prisoner, a fragment of life lingering centuries later. Such finds are not fiction. Archaeologists have indeed uncovered scraps of clothing, shoes, even buttons in long-forgotten cells. Each one is testimony to human presence, whispering louder than any written record. A curious belief persisted among some guards, that dungeons were hungry for voices. They said silence angered the stones, and so captives screamed whether tortured or not to appease their walls. Perhaps it was a cruel jest. Perhaps it was a genuine superstition. Either way, it reveals the truth. Sound was inseparable from suffering. You lean your head against the wall now, listening. Your breath is shallow, your pulse loud. And then another sound. Not a scream this time, but a low sob, faint as a sigh. You close your eyes, unsure whether it is real or conjured. The dungeon does not care which. For you, it is enough to know that even in solitude, you are never truly alone. You share this darkness with echoes. The noise fades, replaced again by silence. But silence is no mercy. It presses harder than sound, forcing you to hear your own heartbeat, your own breath, your own weakness. You realize why medieval prisoners wrote of silence louder than bells. It is not emptiness, it is suffocation. Above, music plays, laughter rises, fire crackles. Below, the only chorus is human suffering carried by stone. You press forward, though every sound feels heavier. Each drip, each rattle, each phantom cry adds weight to your shoulders. And you begin to see why no one survives a night here, not because of violence, but because of sound. The dungeon is never quiet. It sings endlessly, and you cannot stop listening. The echo fades into nothing, and for a moment you almost welcome the silence again. But the silence in a dungeon never lasts, not truly. It bends, it folds, and it reshapes itself into new torment. As you stand there, body quivering from chill and hunger, the absence of sound makes you hyper-aware of your own. You hear your teeth clicking together, the faint wheeze of breath slipping through cracked lips, the twitch of fabric brushing against your sleeve. And into this fragile stillness creeps a new realization. The silence is not empty, it is waiting. Then, faintly, almost like a trick of imagination, another sound arrives. It is low, guttural, stretched thin as though dragged from a throat against its will. You pause, straining your ears. At first you think it is only your mind replaying the screams from earlier. But no, this is different. It is softer, slower, and it comes not from above but from beside you, seeping through the stone wall as though the blocks themselves have begun to speak. Contemporary records mention how dungeon walls carried noise unpredictably. In some castles, prisoners swore they could hear people many chambers away as though they were beside them. Builders never intended it, or so some experts say, but the effect was undeniable. The acoustics turned stone into a cruel game of distance. What you heard might be near or far, recent or centuries old, alive or remembered. You press your ear to the wall and catch the faintest trace of weeping. Archaeologists in Prague once discovered scratch marks etched directly beside wall seams, as though captives pressed their faces close, desperate to hear or be heard. Were they listening for hope, or only confirming they were not alone? Interpretations differ, but you understand the impulse instantly. Here in this shadow, loneliness cuts as deeply as chains. To hear another voice, even in suffering, becomes proof of existence. One curious anecdote appears in the chronicles of a German abbot. He describes how captives sometimes knocked on walls, inventing crude codes of rhythm to speak to neighbors unseen. 2 knocks for yes, 1 for no. 3 for food, 4 for water. Whether these messages were understood or merely desperate gestures hardly matters. The act itself was lifeline enough. Imagine sitting chained in dark, tapping against stone, hoping someone somewhere would tap back. You pause, waiting, wondering if the dungeon will answer. At first there is nothing, then a faint tap, just once. It might be coincidence, the settling of stone, or it might be history itself replying. Either way, the hair on your arms rises. and your stomach knots tighter than hunger alone could manage. Historians remain divided about whether these dungeons were truly filled with voices night after night, or if later writers exaggerated the atmosphere to frighten readers. But exaggeration is unnecessary. Even one cry, one sob, one scrape is enough to unravel a mind already hollowed by cold. Here in your imagining, the faint tap is louder than any trumpet. The sobbing fades, replaced by stillness, and into that stillness comes an unexpected intruder, your own memory. You hear laughter above, imagined but vivid guards sharing drink, nobles feasting, children running in courtyards. The contrast slices deeper than chains. While you rot below, the world above spins on, indifferent. You move forward, feet dragging against stone, and the silence thickens again. This time it carries weight, like a cloak thrown across your shoulders. You realize now that silence is not absence. It is presence. It is a constant companion, and unlike rats or water or straw, you cannot fight it. You cannot scratch it away or chew it into crumbs. It surrounds you fully, pressing into your ears until your own heartbeat becomes thunder. A curious superstition emerges from the annals of Venetian jails. Prisoners claimed silence itself was poison. They insisted it seeped into blood, slowing the heart, making limbs heavy. Some said it could even kill, that men died not from hunger or thirst but from the sheer pressure of soundlessness. Scholars dismiss the idea, yet psychologists today recognize a truth. Sensory deprivation corrodes the mind, and medieval prisoners, though they lacked the term, knew the effect intimately. You close your eyes, but the dark does not change. You try humming to yourself, desperate to fill the void, but the sound falters, thin and weak. It comes back twisted, warped by echo, like another voice mocking your tune. You stop quickly, unnerved by the thought that someone or something might be listening. Travelers' tales describe how silence broke men more thoroughly than torture. One Italian observer claimed that prisoners often begged for whips, for beatings, for anything to shatter the endless hush. Imagine craving pain because pain meant noise, and noise meant proof that you still lived. That reversal captures perfectly the cruelty of dungeon silence. Suffering becomes preferable to nothingness. You shuffle on, hugging yourself, and notice a strange rhythm in your steps. 1, 2, 3, pause. The sound comforts you, a crude replacement for lost heartbeat rhythm. You realize that prisoners must have invented similar tricks. Perhaps they tapped chains deliberately, or recited prayers aloud, or repeated names endlessly to anchor themselves. Archaeological finds of scratched verses and tally marks confirm as much. Repetition became survival. Routine was not just habit, it was shield against silence. Yet silence always wins. It returns after every word, every tap, every breath. It floods the chamber like icy water, filling cracks, seeping into ears, drowning thought. It becomes a mirror, forcing you to listen not to walls but to yourself. And that is the most unbearable thing, hearing the fragility of your own body, the dwindling of your own resolve. You lean against stone, forehead pressed hard, and whisper just once, "I am here." The words sound pitiful in the void, and their echo does not comfort. It scatters, returns, distorted, as though the dungeon laughs softly at your insistence. And then you understand. The silence is not waiting, it is devouring. It consumes every cry, every word, every breath, leaving nothing behind. That is why dungeons remain haunted long after emptied. They are filled not with ghosts, but with echoes swallowed whole. Above, bells ring, voices chatter, songs rise. Below, the silence endures, louder than all of it combined. You step forward again, body trembling, carrying with you the knowledge that one night in a dungeon means not only cold, not only hunger, not only thirst, but silence so complete it erases you. And that silence, more than any chain, ensures you would not last till dawn. The hush lingers around you like a thick blanket, But unlike any blanket you've ever known, this one steals warmth rather than giving it. You step cautiously, palms brushing against damp stone for guidance, and soon the corridor broadens slightly. Here the air grows oddly heavy, as though saturated not only with moisture but with something intangible, something pressed deep into the walls over centuries. You draw in a shallow breath, and the taste of rust and mildew floods your tongue again. And then you realize what has been missing for the last several steps. The voices, the cries, the rattling chains, the tapping on walls gone. For a fleeting instant, the absence feels like relief. But relief doesn't last, because suddenly the silence becomes oppressive, so complete that you feel smothered by it. And in that smothering stillness you begin to notice the weight of time itself. Medieval writers often describe dungeon confinement, not in terms of hours or days, but of eternity. Prisoners measured life in darkness, not calendars. Without sun, they guessed seasons by the chill of draughts, or the number of times rats bred in the straw. Modern scholars interpret these descriptions as exaggeration, yet even they admit that without natural markers, days blend indistinguishably into nights. Already, here in your imagination, you feel hours slipping like sand through your fingers, leaving only unease. You shift your hand along the wall and encounter something unexpected: shallow grooves. Not names this time, not tallies, but patterns, crosshatches, spirals, meaningless scratches etched by desperate fingernails or crude tools. Archaeologists find such markings across Europe. Some insist they were idle fidgets, signs of madness creeping in. Others suggest ritual, attempts to ward off evil spirits lurking in the dark. Interpretations diverge, but the result is the same: marks of men and women who could not bear to leave stone untouched. You press your own fingertip into the groove, and for a moment you feel kinship with someone long gone, as if touching a hand across centuries. A curious custom is noted in certain monastic texts. Some prisoners sang hymns softly into the darkness, not out of devotion alone, but to reassure themselves of presence. The words wrapped around them like invisible walls, keeping despair at bay. Others muttered secular songs, ballads of love, of travel, of sunlight. Did the songs lift them, or deepen their longing? Scholars argue still, but either way, it was proof that silence could be resisted, if only for moments. You try humming again, tentatively, and this time you sustain it longer. The note trembles at first, but steadies. It fills the chamber weakly, bouncing back in warped tones, but the act comforts you for a heartbeat. Then the echo shifts, elongates, and you flinch, because now it sounds like another voice. You fall silent immediately, heart pounding, once again uncertain whether you were truly alone. The silence returns stronger, as if punishing you for daring to disturb it. You breathe quickly, chest rising and falling, and the sound of your own breath feels embarrassingly loud. Every exhale roars in your ears. You realize now what countless captives must have felt: an unbearable intimacy with themselves. With no distractions, no noise, the body becomes prison to its own sounds. The pulse in your wrist, the groan of your stomach, the pop of joints each magnifies into thunder. Some prisoners recorded visions born of this sensory starvation. They swore that silence turned into images, faint glimmers of figures, saints, demons, lost family. A nobleman in Milan once wrote that he saw his dead brother step out of darkness to sit beside him, speaking in calm tones. Was it grief, hallucination, or miracle? No one can say. But in a place like this, you begin to see how silence itself can become painter, sculptor, storyteller. A curious oddity emerges in a French chronicle. Guards sometimes staged false sounds, dropping chains, faking screams, rattling bars just to torment prisoners with confusion. Imagine lying awake, half believing someone was being dragged away, only for nothing to happen. This trickery, whether rare or common, reveals the cruelty possible when silence is manipulated deliberately. You would never know what was real, what was theatre. You shuffle further, and your foot brushes against something soft. You crouch, touching what feels like cloth, brittle and damp. A sleeve, perhaps, long since abandoned. You lift it and it disintegrates between your fingers, scattering into dust. You cough as the particles invade your lungs. And for a moment, you swear you smell sweat, faint but human. The dungeon holds its history in fragments like these fabric, bones, scratches, all tiny reminders that others suffered before you. And yet, in this oppressive stillness, memory itself becomes enemy. You recall sunlight, laughter, meals, fire. They intrude unbidden, sharper now because they are unreachable. Silence weaponizes memory, forcing you to relive comforts you cannot touch. It turns nostalgia into torture. That, more than chains, ensures you will not survive the night. Scholars continue to argue whether these cells were primarily punitive or simply holding pens. Some suggest that the tales of endless torment grew over centuries, exaggerated by storytellers. But exaggeration feels unnecessary when you experience the silence firsthand. No dramatist could invent the crushing weight of nothing pressing on your ears until they ring, of absence so loud it drowns thought. You slump against the wall, exhausted, letting your body slide to the damp floor. The chill seeps instantly through your clothes. You curl your knees up, trying to conserve warmth, and close your eyes. The silence swallows you whole. You count breaths, 1, 2, 3, but lose track quickly, the rhythm faltering. Without sound, without light, your sense of self slips. A peculiar superstition once whispered among captives said that silence steals names. Spend too long underground, and you forget who you are. Some scribbled their names repeatedly on walls, terrified of vanishing into anonymity. And indeed, archaeologists have uncovered cells etched endlessly with single names, carved over and over like mantras. Was it identity reclaimed, or madness setting in? The debate lingers, but as you sit here, you feel the temptation to whisper your own name aloud, just to prove it exists. But you resist, because even your name feels fragile in this stillness, and you are not sure you want to hear it twisted by echo. Instead, you rock gently, a primitive motion, the same motion prisoners used for comfort across centuries, back and forth, stone pressing into your spine, cold wrapping your legs. You breathe shallowly, and the silence presses closer, settling into you like frost. And now you see clearly why one night here is impossible. Not because of hunger alone, or thirst, or cold, but because silence itself gnaws. It scrapes identity from skin, turns memory against you, carves hollowness into bone. You open your eyes again, staring into endless black, and realize the dungeon does not need to kill, it simply waits. You force yourself upright, joints protesting, and listen again. Somewhere above, faint and muffled, comes the heavy rhythm of boots. The sound is steady, measured, the kind of cadence that belongs to men who are not cold, not starving, not forgotten, guards. Their footsteps move across wooden planks far overhead, each strike filtered through layers of stone. The sound does not comfort you. It reminds you that life carries on above while you remain here, buried. In medieval chronicles, guards were often described as both gatekeepers and tormentors. They controlled not only access to food and water, but also access to sound, light, and even hope. Captives depended on them entirely, and that dependence was part of the punishment. Chroniclers noted that guards could prolong life or hasten death with nothing more than indifference. You imagine those boots pausing directly above you, the men laughing, drinking, perhaps tossing dice while their prisoners shivered beneath. One curious record from 15th century France tells of guards who warmed themselves by great hearths before descending to deliver cold rations to captives. They carried with them the smell of smoke and meat, and prisoners remembered that scent more painfully than whips. Imagine the cruelty of sniffing roasted pork clinging to a guard's cloak, knowing you would never taste it. The scent itself became a weapon. Specialists in social history still argue whether guards were universally cruel or if some offered kindness in secret. Documents survive describing guards smuggling extra bread to captives, sometimes out of pity, sometimes for bribes. Other accounts paint them as sadists who mocked the weak, rattled chains for amusement and poured water just beyond prisoners' reach. The truth likely varied from castle to castle, man to man. But for you, here in the dark, the sound of boots carries no promise, only distance. The boots fade, and another sound follows. Laughter. Muffled, yes, but unmistakable. The guards are talking, joking, perhaps telling bawdy stories. Their merriment drifts downward like a taunt, proof that the world above is warm and alive. In contrast, you remain buried in frost and shadow. The dungeon amplifies contrast until it hurts more than hunger. A peculiar anecdote appears in English records. Prisoners often counted footsteps, trying to predict guard rotations. They listened carefully, memorizing rhythms, crafting hope of escape. Some even tapped coded questions into walls, desperate to confirm schedules. Yet more often than not, those patterns betrayed nothing. Guards varied their paths deliberately, aware that even footsteps could become lifelines. You tilt your head, straining again. This time, the boots return closer, heavier. They descend stairs somewhere in the distance, their sound echoing. Soon, faint torchlight glimmers far ahead, bouncing against walls. You narrow your eyes, shielding them against the sudden flare. It has been so long since brightness that even a flicker feels blinding. You raise your hand, fingers trembling, realizing how dependent you have become on darkness. The light grows, and with it the figures of two guards emerge. Their armor clinks softly, their voices muffled by helmets. They do not look at you. They do not need to. They pass by, carrying buckets. Water sloshes audibly. Bread crusts rattle in wooden bowls. You step forward instinctively, desperate, but they ignore you. They move toward another cell, deliver their meager gifts, then turn back, their torches hissing with resin. And then, without a word, they leave. Their boots retreat, their light shrinks, until only blackness returns. You are left in silence once more. The cruelty stings not because they harmed you, but because they treated you as nothing. Indifference cuts deeper than blows. One Venetian observer noted this dynamic with horror. The lash wounds only the flesh, but neglect wounds the soul. His words survive because they capture precisely what you feel. Guards did not need to strike. They only needed to ignore, to carry warmth and sustenance past you without pause, to remind you that your existence mattered less than the rats at their feet. A strange superstition arose among prisoners. Some believed guards carried fragments of sunlight on their clothes. They tried to press close, to inhale the warmth radiating from cloaks or boots, as if heat could be stolen through breath. Was this madness? Or was it instinct, a body desperate for any trace of comfort? Accounts differ, but either way, you now understand the longing. You would press your face to a guard's shadow, just to borrow the faint warmth clinging there. Archaeological evidence lends eerie confirmation. In certain castle basements, layers of compacted dirt near doors suggest prisoners crowding constantly toward entrances, pressing themselves against thresholds whenever guards passed. The ground remembers even when names are lost. The boots are gone now, but their echoes remain. You replay the sound in your mind, again and again, until it seems almost melodic. Step, 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 pause. You catch yourself swaying gently to the rhythm, as though turning torment into lullaby. Perhaps this is how others endured, by reshaping cruelty into pattern, by transforming the indifference of guards into a kind of bleak music. Still, the silence that follows hurts worse, because now you know what life sounds like. The laughter above, the footsteps, the clink of bowls, all reminders that warmth exists, just beyond reach. The knowledge is sharper than cold, heavier than chains. And so you stand in the dark, body aching, heart heavy, realizing the cruelest weapon of all may not be silence or sound, but contrast. Above, boots strike with confidence. Below, Your feet shuffle weakly, leaving no mark. Above, men laugh without care. Below, your own breath stumbles, ragged with thirst. The divide is absolute, and you are buried on the wrong side. No, you would not last a night, not with guards walking overhead as though you never existed. The echo of boots fades into distance, leaving you once again with stone darkness and your own faltering breath. But even as silence settles, another dread rises in its place, not the certainty of cold or hunger, but the uncertainty of what might come next. You recall whispered rumors that prisons below castles were not merely for holding, but also for punishment far worse than deprivation. Tales drifted upward of chambers reserved for agony, of instruments designed not to kill swiftly, but to prolong the collapse of flesh and spirit. How much of that is truth, and how much embellishment? Records are inconsistent. Some medieval accounts describe elaborate devices, the rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden. Others suggest that these were rare, exaggerated by fearful minds or later storytellers. Scholars remain divided. Were such devices truly common, or were they symbols of cruelty more than reality? The uncertainty itself becomes its own form of torture. You do not know if pain waits around the next corner or if despair alone will finish you. And yet, as you move deeper into the dungeon, you find signs that lend weight to the darker rumors. A recess in the wall bears hooks of iron, still strong enough to bear weight. Chains dangle loosely, their ends frayed with rust. The stones beneath them are stained darker than the rest, as though moisture or something else soaked them long ago. You reach down, touch the patch, and recoil as though it burns. Whether the discoloration came from blood or from centuries of damp hardly matters. The impression is clear. Suffering took place here. In some chronicles, prisoners spoke of hearing not only screams but confessions, men and women forced to speak names, secrets, treasons under duress. Kings and lords valued these basements not only as jails but as chambers of information. The dungeon was theatre, and pain was the script. Did everyone truly endure such torment? Perhaps not. But when you stand in the dark, even the possibility is enough to hollow your chest with dread. One curious note survives in the journal of a 15th century visitor to Ghent. He describes a device resembling a chair, its wooden arms fitted with iron cuffs, its seat carved with ridges to prevent rest. The prisoner sat for hours, days even, their own body weight becoming torment. This was not spectacle for crowds, but private erosion of strength. Whether this chair still exists, or whether the journal exaggerated, historians cannot agree. But imagine yourself chained there, unable to shift, cold creeping into joints until each minute felt like a day. Other scholars insist that real dungeons relied less on such contraptions and more on simple deprivation. Why waste iron and carpentry when cold, hunger, and thirst accomplished the same ends? The debate continues, unresolved. But as your eyes trace those hooks on the wall, you cannot shake the feeling that both answers are true. Some dungeons broke prisoners slowly, others more brutally. All broke them eventually. A peculiar anecdote lingers from German folklore. Villagers whispered that some lords employed sound itself as torment. They described a hollow drum placed near cells, struck at irregular intervals to disrupt sleep. Others spoke of guards scraping metal along bars, letting the shrieks of iron echo endlessly. Whether these tales were literal or metaphor, they reveal a truth you already sense here. Even anticipation of pain becomes pain itself. You press onward, though your legs quiver with weakness. You enter another chamber, this one larger, and your boots clink against something metallic on the floor. You crouch, brushing aside damp straw, and uncover fragments. A bent ring of iron, a length of chain, a nail corroded into stone. These are artifacts of control, tools once held in human hands. Archaeologists have found similar remnants, often catalogued in silence, though their meaning requires imagination. Were they restraints? Building scraps? Instruments of torment? The answers vanish into rust. Yet each piece tells you what words cannot. Men once suffered here, reduced to objects, remembered only by their tools. You pause, and suddenly, faintly, a cry rings out again. Not loud this time, softer, choked, as though carried by memory rather than breath. You shiver, not knowing whether the sound is real or conjured by your own fear. And then you recall something another prisoner once claimed in writing. The stones themselves rehearse the pain of those who died. He believed the dungeon replayed torment like an echo preserved forever. Scholars dismiss such statements as hallucination, but in the stillness, with hooks overhead and rust beneath, you begin to wonder. You shift your weight, uneasy, and your cloak brushes the floor. Moisture soaks into the fabric, icy against your skin. You imagine shackled wrists tugging against iron here, backs pressed against stone, voices cracking under pressure. The scene is too vivid to dismiss. You cannot help but whisper a prayer, not because you expect salvation, but because centuries of men and women did the same, their words layering over one another like sediment. A curious superstition emerges again in prisoner law. They believed that confession under pain was binding not just in law but in spirit. A man who spoke a falsehood to end his agony might carry that lie into eternity. Some etched pleas for forgiveness into stone, desperate to undo what chains had forced from their lips. Archaeologists in Eastern Europe have found scratched Latin phrases, miserere mei, have mercy on me. Each carving is both apology and accusation. You take another step and stumble, knees striking hard stone. Pain jolts up your legs, sudden and sharp, and for a moment it feels like the dungeon itself has grabbed you. You remain kneeling, forehead pressed to the floor, breath shallow. In that position, you understand something essential. The dungeon does not need elaborate devices. The environment itself is an executioner. Every stumble, every draft, every deprivation sharpening into agony. Specialists in penal history often phrase it this way. Torture was less an event than a condition. It was not always ropes and whips. It was waiting, listening, fearing, freezing. That was enough to fracture the strongest. You rise slowly, muscles screaming, and press your back to the wall. The hooks loom overhead, silent, yet their presence alone weighs heavy. You realize now that part of survival here was never knowing whether tonight would bring chains, neglect, or blades. That uncertainty ensured no one lasted. Above, nobility gathered in courts, demanding truth and loyalty. Below, truth was manufactured through silence, fear, or torment. And the dungeon, whether by design or by accident, became the stage upon which human will was unmade. You step away from the wall, but the echo of chains follows. You carry with you the vision of hooks and stains, of cries real or imagined. And you understand at last. The dungeon does not always shout its cruelty. Sometimes it whispers, quietly but insistently, that pain is only a breath away. The hooks and chains fade into shadow as you press onward, but the dread they planted in your mind lingers. You know now that even if the guards never touch you, your body will not remain untouched. Something else will come for you. And indeed, it already has. You pause, and your ears prick to a faint rustling not far away. At first, you think it is rats again, but the sound is different, softer, quicker, more frantic. Then you feel it, a tickle against your ankle. You flinch, swat, and brush away something crawling. Your imagination tells you what it must be, but the truth is worse. It doesn't matter if you see them. They are everywhere. Lice, fleas, mites, creatures that thrive in filth, multiplying in straw, feeding on warm blood. Prisoners of the Middle Ages wrote bitterly of them, often describing how infestations drove them mad faster than chains. One man held in Rouen confessed that he scratched so hard his own skin bled more than whips ever did. He preferred lashings to the constant itch of invisible enemies. Archaeologists confirm his complaint. They have sifted through compacted dungeon straw to find preserved shells of lice, thousands of years old. Their abundance proves what words only hinted. Vermin were not accidents here. They were permanent residents. A peculiar account from a Spanish friar describes prisoners bathing in firelight, not water to drive pests away. When straw caught alight, the smoke forced lice and fleas into the open. But fire was rare below, so the relief came seldom, and often too late. The friar noted that men sometimes pressed lit candles to their skin, burning away nests of lice despite the blisters that followed. Was this survival or desperation? You suspect it was both. You scratch at your own arm instinctively now, though you know nothing clings there. The phantom itch burrows deep, convincing your nerves that insects crawl across your body. You slap again, harder, but the sensation remains. You imagine lying in damp straw, feeling movement across your ribs, your scalp, your groin constant, endless. Sleep would be impossible. Peace would be fantasy. Specialists in medieval medicine argue about whether infestations were tolerated intentionally or ignored as unavoidable. Some claim guards encouraged vermin to weaken prisoners without lifting a hand. Others believe it was negligence, byproducts of straw and filth. Either way, the result was the same: bites, infection, fever. And for you, the psychological torment may be worse than the physical. A curious superstition circulated among captives. They believed fleas carried whispers from the dead. Each bite was thought to deliver memory, as though vermin were messengers of forgotten souls. Was this folklore or madness shaped by itching nights? Historians cannot decide. But as you stand here, feeling phantom bites, you almost believe it. The itch feels alive, purposeful. You move forward again, trying to distract yourself, but your legs tremble. You imagine a prisoner scratching until fingernails cracked, until blood streaked straw, until skin was raw. Chroniclers describe men reduced to skeletons not only by hunger but by parasites draining them slowly. They did not die of wounds or whips, but of 1,000 tiny mouths. One obscure note survives from Milan. A prisoner wrote that he befriended a rat because it ate the lice from his bedding. The tale sounds unbelievable, yet it captures the desperation perfectly. When vermin are tormentors, another vermin becomes savior, and in the dungeon, you take what comfort you can. Archaeologists sometimes find combs buried with remains of prisoners, rough wooden teeth worn down by use. These were not grooming tools for vanity, they were weapons in a war against lice. The grooves etched into combs by constant scraping testify to nightly battles fought in darkness. Even combs became symbols of survival. You scratch again at your scalp, though nothing is there. The phantom sensation is so convincing you nearly cry out. And then you realize, this is the dungeon's most insidious cruelty. It convinces your mind of what may not exist, until your body reacts anyway. You don't need real lice, the suggestion alone is enough to torment. You slump against the wall, trembling. Your nails dig into your flesh, leaving crescents of pain, but you welcome it. Pain feels real. Pain means you're alive. The itch is worse because it's uncertain, unprovable. Was it real? Was it imagined? The dungeon thrives on that uncertainty. Specialists in psychology today would call it somatic panic, the body inventing sensations under stress. But medieval prisoners lacked the words. They wrote only of endless itch and skin that crawls with shadows. Their language may be crude, but it captures your experience perfectly. And then, to worsen matters, you hear scurrying again. Rats return, emboldened by your weakness. You imagine them nosing your body while you sleep, licking at sores, nibbling at wounds left by scratching. Contemporary accounts mention rats biting toes and ears, attracted to sweat and salt. Guards laughed when captives screamed in the night, dismissing it as imagination. But bones found with gnaw marks prove otherwise. You realize that one night in this place is not merely cold and hunger, it is a war against vermin. A battle you cannot win, because they never rest. While you weaken, they thrive. A peculiar anecdote from a German ballad tells of a prisoner who declared, "The lice will bury me before the Lord does." His words sound grimly poetic, yet entirely believable. You feel the truth in your own crawling skin. You stagger to your feet again, pushing forward, but your pace slows. Each brush of fabric feels like insect legs. Each draft feels like wings. You slap your arm, scratch your neck, rub your calves raw, but relief never comes. Above, nobles wear silks, scented oils keeping parasites at bay. Below, you claw yourself bloody, reduced to prey for creatures so small they're nearly invisible. And this, too, is why you would not last a night. Because the dungeon does not only strip you of warmth and light, it strips you of dignity. It reduces you to a host, a feeding ground. You are no longer human, only sustenance. You close your eyes, try to breathe, try to forget the itch, but the itch is eternal. It is the song of the dungeon, quieter than screams but sharper than blades. And as you press on into darkness, you understand. The greatest tormentors here may not be guards or chains, but creatures too small to see, too many to fight, too constant to endure. You stumble deeper into the dungeon, your skin still prickling with phantom itches. Just when you think you've adjusted to the cold and vermin, something subtler begins to gnaw at you. A faint stream of air brushes across your cheek. It is not steady, like wind above ground. It pulses, threads its way through cracks, as though the dungeon itself exhales. Each draft cuts sharper than a blade, finding the weakest spots on your body, your neck, your wrists, your ankles, and slipping beneath fabric like a thief. You pause, shivering. Where does this draft come from? Above? Beyond? Or is it the dungeon mocking you, offering proof that an outside world still exists while keeping it unreachable? Medieval prisoners wondered the same. Records from castles in England mention that captives sometimes traced drafts obsessively, hoping they pointed to escape routes. They pressed their faces to cracks, inhaling deeply, telling themselves they could smell daylight or trees. Of course, those cracks rarely led anywhere but to other damp corridors. Still, the draft offered cruel hope. A curious note survives from a 15th century French chronicle. One captive claimed he could tell the time of day by the feel of air moving through gaps in stone. He believed dawn carried a softer breath, while night pressed cold harder against skin. Scholars doubt his accuracy, but they admit the desperation makes sense. In darkness, any change becomes a clock. You too begin to wonder whether this draft marks night or morning, though you know rationally it is only the same frozen air. The draft grows stronger as you continue forward. It snakes along the wall, bringing with it an odor of rot damp earth, mingled with something sweet and spoiled. You gag, realizing it carries not only cold but stench from above kitchens, stables, refuse. Castles often funneled waste down chutes, and those shafts doubled as conduits for foul air. You inhale unwillingly, and the taste of dung clings to your tongue. Archaeologists have documented waste shafts leading directly into lower chambers, sometimes mistaken for air vents. Their design shows little concern for those below. Imagine sitting chained in a cell, the stench of latrines streaming constantly across your face. Ventilation becomes suffocation. You understand why so many prisoners described air not as relief but as curse. And yet, not all drafts were foul. Some carried hints of freedom, scents of rain, of grass, of wood smoke. A Venetian prisoner once wrote that the faint smell of pine drifting through a crack gave him enough hope to survive another week. Was he imagining it? Possibly. But in a world stripped bare of sensation, even illusion becomes lifeline. You close your eyes, trying the same trick, picturing air that smells of summer. For a heartbeat, you almost succeed. Then the real stench returns, and hope collapses. Specialists in medieval architecture debate whether drafts were accidental or intentional. Some argue that shafts were meant for ventilation, crude efforts at airflow. Others insist they were designed to disorient, to let captives sense the outside without ever reaching it. Both theories feel true here. The draft proves there is a world beyond, but it denies access, teasing your senses until they ache. A peculiar superstition emerged among guards. They claimed drafts carried spirits. Cold air was called the breath of the forgotten. They told stories of souls slipping back into cells on gusts, whispering to the living. Whether this was mockery or belief is uncertain, but captives recorded hearing voices in drafts, pleas, curses, prayers. Was it merely wind shaping itself in cracks or something else? In the silence, you almost hear the same. You press your face closer to the wall, feeling the air flow more directly. It chills your skin instantly, numbing your lips. You imagine shouting into the crack, begging for help. But the air only hisses back, indifferent. And now you realize another cruelty. The draft steals heat. Every sigh of wind strips a little warmth from your body. The longer you linger, the colder you become. One chronicler described this perfectly. The stone takes our strength, but the air steals our souls. His words may be dramatic, but standing here, they feel precise. Cold stone drains you slowly. Drafts snatch warmth suddenly, repeatedly, until you despair of ever conserving heat. You wrap your cloak tighter, but it is useless. The air finds its way in. You walk on, though each step brings new gusts. Some brush your ankles, others press against your chest, one even snakes down your collar. You shudder violently, teeth chattering, unable to stop. Your body responds instinctively, but the effort wastes precious energy. Soon fatigue joins cold, dragging you down like lead weights. Archaeological evidence suggests that many prisoners died, not of starvation or wounds, but of exposure. Bones show little trauma, but writings mention endless shivering, collapsed lungs, stiffened joints. Drafts were not minor inconveniences, they were killers. You begin to understand why, because they denied rest. Even in exhaustion, a sudden gust would jolt you awake, clawing heat away just as you drifted towards sleep. You pause, leaning against stone. The draft whistles faintly here, forming almost a tune. You close your eyes, letting it wash over you, and you could almost believe it speaks words. Leave. Leave. But there is no leaving. The wall remains solid, the world beyond unreachable. A strange tale survives from Bohemian folklore. Prisoners whispered that those who followed drafts too far lost themselves. They crawled through shafts only to become wedged, their cries muffled, their bodies discovered years later as skeletons clinging to cracks. Whether myth or truth, the story reflects the danger of hope in places built to deny it. You straighten slowly, every bone stiff. The draft continues its work, biting, teasing, mocking. You take another step, then another, though you feel weaker with each. It dawns on you that the dungeon doesn't need guards to break you. It enlists the very air, invisible, relentless, unavoidable. Above, breezes stir banners in sunlight. Below, gusts slither like knives, stealing what little warmth you carry. The contrast, once again, is unbearable. And so you keep walking, skin raw, joints stiff, knowing you cannot escape the draft. It is companion and executioner both, proof that the world exists beyond these walls, and proof that you will never reach it. The draft still snakes along your skin as you step forward into another passage. This one opens suddenly, the ceiling rising higher than before. For a moment you think the air feels different, less foul, almost reverent. Then your eyes catch faint grooves cut into the stone. You move closer, fingertips brushing the surface, and realize they are not random scratches. They are letters. Someone carved words here, though the edges are softened by centuries. Some letters are Latin, others crude symbols, some barely legible. You trace a line, lips forming the words silently. Domine miserere. Lord, have mercy. The plea bites harder than the cold. You know instantly that this was not the hand of a careless visitor, but the desperate prayer of a prisoner who knew no one else would ever read it. Archaeologists have catalogued hundreds of such inscriptions across European castles. In the Tower of London, names of traitors and rebels still etch the walls. In Germany and Italy, crosses dominate, scratched by hands that trembled but clung to faith. Some were carved deeply, with tools smuggled or stolen. Others are so shallow they could only have been made with fingernails, etched until the nails split and bled. You press your own nail against the wall now, and the futility feels suffocating. A peculiar discovery from a French fortress reveals tiny drawings mixed among the prayers, birds, ships, stars. Scholars debate their meaning. Were they symbols of freedom, memories of life above, or simply fragments of imagination etched before madness consumed the carver? The interpretations vary, but the intent is undeniable. Prisoners carved to remind themselves they were still human. You kneel, squinting at another inscription lower on the wall. It is a series of tally marks, dozens, maybe hundreds. Each line is uneven, some thick, some faint. You imagine a man scratching one mark for each day, watching them blur together until he no longer knew if he counted hours, weeks, or years. Some historians argue these tallies exaggerate captivity, but others note the psychological truth. When time ceases to exist, repetition becomes survival. The air in this chamber grows heavier with meaning. You feel surrounded not only by stone, but by voices long gone. Their scratches are more eloquent than screams. They tell you that someone once sat here, freezing as you freeze, starving as you starve, and still found strength to carve. You almost hear their whisper, "I was here. Remember me." A curious superstition once spread among prisoners. They believed carving names into stone bound their souls there, ensuring they would not vanish entirely when the dungeon claimed them. To die without leaving a mark was to vanish forever. Some carved their names hundreds of times, as if inscribing them into eternity. Archaeologists have indeed uncovered walls where one word repeats endlessly, proof of both defiance and despair. You press your palm to the wall, the grooves rough beneath skin. For a moment, you feel connection, fragile but undeniable. Someone touched this stone before you, centuries ago, perhaps whispering the same prayer you now whisper in silence. But the inscriptions are not all hopeful. Some are curses. You trace one crude line. It's Latin jagged. Maleditus sit dominus. Cursed be the Lord. Others scratched insults against guards, drawings of devils with twisted horns. These testify to anger rather than faith. They reveal another truth. Not all prisoners submitted quietly. Some raged, carving fury into walls, even as their bodies weakened. One oddity found in Italy shows this vividly. A carving of a game board, etched into dungeon floor. Was it a distraction? A last attempt at amusement? Scholars puzzle, but it suggests that even in chains, men sought fragments of normal life. Imagine two prisoners scratching pebbles across stone squares, playing while hunger chewed at their bellies. The game meant more than entertainment, it was defiance against despair. You shuffle forward, fingers still brushing inscriptions, and realize you have entered a gallery of ghosts. Each mark is a voice. Each line is a testimony. Some plead, some rage, some hope, some resign. Together, they create a chorus louder than any scream. Specialists remain divided on how much of this graffiti is authentic to prisoners and how much might have been added later by visitors or guards. Yet even skeptics admit the sheer number of markings proves something vital. People needed to leave themselves behind. Whether noble or peasant, whether tortured or merely forgotten, each prisoner resisted invisibility with scratches in stone. You crouch again, noticing one final inscription at ankle height. It is faint, almost gone, but legible enough. Mater, mother. The single word twists deeper than all others. You imagine a young man, perhaps barely grown, whispering for the woman who once comforted him, now unreachable. No plea, no curse, just a memory carved in stone. Your throat tightens. You realize then that this dungeon is not only a place of cold and chains, it is also a library, filled with texts written not in ink but in scratches, stains, and grooves. It holds stories of faith, fury, memory, love. And the most terrible truth is this: no one above ever cared to read them. You lean back against the opposite wall, closing your eyes. The inscriptions blur in darkness, but you still feel them beneath your fingertips. They remind you that even silence is never absolute here. The walls speak, if you learn to listen. Above, scribes copy manuscripts in warm halls, words preserved for posterity. Below, prisoners carve with nails, their ink blood, their parchment stone. And yet, their words survive too. Even now, centuries later, you read them. And in that realization lies the cruelest paradox. The dungeon erases lives, but preserves voices. It kills, but it remembers. And you, walking here in imagination, have become the audience they longed for but never had. You rise again, shivering, stepping deeper into shadow. Behind you, the wall whispers still, "Remember me." The wall of inscriptions fades into blackness as you leave the chamber behind. Yet the memory of those carved pleas clings to your fingertips, phantom grooves imprinted on your skin. You walk slower now, for your body grows heavy. It isn't only hunger or thirst or cold, it is something deeper, something creeping from inside. Exhaustion. At first it manifests as trembling legs. Your knees quiver even when you stop, as if muscles refuse to obey you. Your arms hang useless, too heavy to lift. You stagger, pressing against the wall for balance. But the stone offers no comfort. It is damp and merciless, sucking more warmth from you each time you lean. Medieval records often speak of exhaustion as though it were a deliberate punishment. Guards rarely struck, because they didn't need to. They only needed to deprive. Captives deprived of food, water, light, and rest would collapse on their own. Chroniclers used phrases like the long death or the slow fading. You now understand that these were not poetic exaggerations. They were descriptions of a body surrendering in increments. You pause, crouching, and notice your breath rasping. It echoes back at you in shallow gasps. Your ribs ache. Your chest tightens. The air here is not heavy with smoke or dust, yet breathing still feels difficult. Perhaps it is dampness, clogging lungs, perhaps fatigue itself. Some historians suggest that constant cold weakened immune systems until pneumonia flourished. The bones of captives, excavated centuries later, sometimes show signs of illness rather than violence. Death here came not from swords but from slow collapse. A curious note appears in the diary of a visiting monk. He described prisoners swaying endlessly, unable to rest, too cold to sleep, too weak to stand. He called them living ghosts, men whose eyes dulled long before bodies gave out. The phrase unsettled him so much that he abandoned his inspection after minutes. Imagine how much worse it felt for the prisoners who had no choice but to remain. You shuffle forward, body sagging. Your joints protest with every step, each motion stiff and clumsy. You realize that fatigue here is not ordinary tiredness. It is something crafted by the dungeon itself, designed by conditions that deny renewal. Above ground, rest is natural. Here, every attempt at rest is sabotage. If you lie on straw, vermin torment you. If you close your eyes, drafts jolt you awake. If you try to sleep, screams or silence pierce your ears. Sleep becomes impossible. And without sleep, sanity soon follows. Modern researchers remain divided on whether sleep deprivation was intentional or simply a byproduct of environment. Some argue that guards deliberately disrupted rhythms, banging doors, clattering chains. Others suggest the dungeon itself, with its sounds and cold, ensured insomnia without intervention. Both seem plausible, and both are equally merciless. You lean back against stone again, eyelids drooping despite discomfort. A strange sensation washes over you, dreams intruding while awake. You see flickers of light that aren't there, hear faint laughter that doesn't exist. Captives once described such visions, often writing about phantom meals, phantom voices, phantom freedom. Scholars today would call them hallucinations, but for the prisoners, they were proof of exhaustion hollowing the mind. One peculiar account from Naples tells of a man who claimed he walked in fields of wheat each night while chained underground. He insisted the vision was sent by God, though others suspected it was delirium. Either way, it gave him strength. You wonder whether your own phantom lights and voices might do the same, or whether they will only remind you of what you lack. You shuffle forward again, but your legs falter. You collapse briefly to your knees, the impact jarring bone against stone. Pain flares, but you barely feel it. Fatigue dulls all sensation until even injury becomes distant. Chroniclers note this too. Prisoners sometimes endured wounds passively, too exhausted to cry. Their bodies became husks long before life fully left. And then, in the silence, another cruel thought intrudes. Exhaustion makes you clumsy, forgetful, weak. In this state, even escape, if it were possible, would be pointless. You could not climb stairs, outrun guards, or scale walls. The dungeon ensures not only that you suffer, but that you lose the ability to seek freedom. A peculiar superstition spread among jailers. They claimed exhaustion revealed a soul's true weight. They watched captives sway, mutter, and stumble, saying, "Now we see what he island." Did they believe fatigue stripped away masks, or was it only justification for cruelty? Either way, it suggests that exhaustion became spectacle. You rub your eyes, though no grit is there, only heaviness. The darkness presses deeper, and your head tilts forward of its own accord. For a heartbeat, you nearly sleep standing, but then a draft cuts across your neck and your body jerks awake violently. That shock is almost worse than fatigue itself, the constant denial of rest. Archaeologists have found narrow benches carved into dungeon walls. Some interpret them as resting places, crude comforts. Others argue they were torturous, too narrow to lie on, too hard to relax. Imagine sitting there, dozing, only to slump and strike your head on stone. Rest denied, again and again. You stumble onward, and the floor slopes slightly. Your boots scuff puddles that reflect nothing, but the splash reminds you you're still moving, still alive. Yet even that realization feels heavy. Survival itself becomes burden. Above, nobles recline on feather beds, dreams sweetened by warmth and wine. Below, you collapse into damp straw, your body crawling with vermin, your breath rattling, your eyes refusing to close. The contrast cuts sharper than any whip. And so you keep walking, though each step feels stolen from the grave. You realize now that the dungeon doesn't need to kill you in hours. It erodes you across nights, replacing strength with weariness, until even the act of standing feels like defiance. You will not last, not because your will breaks, but because exhaustion is stronger than will. Because here, even rest betrays you. You drag yourself forward, body sagging, eyes half closed. Fatigue has hollowed you, but still the dungeon finds new ways to gnaw. It isn't only your muscles that ache now, it's your mind. Thoughts slip and tangle, memories surface and vanish, leaving you unsure of what's real. Were the footsteps earlier true, or only your imagination? Did you truly hear a whisper, or was it just dripping water echoing strangely? The dungeon blurs boundaries until certainty itself crumbles. Captives once wrote of this confusion, though their words were often fragmented. One man in Florence scribbled that he dreamed with eyes open, then woke with them closed. Another in Prague confessed he could no longer tell if it was morning or night, though he swore he heard church bells through the walls. Scholars debate whether such accounts describe hallucinations or deliberate deceptions, perhaps. Guards rang bells at odd hours, further disorienting captives. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. Sanity dissolved. You pause, pressing your back to stone, and realize you cannot remember how many steps you've taken. Was it minutes since you left the chamber of inscriptions? Or hours? You count backward, then stop, unable to recall the number you started with. Fear tightens your chest, because memory is one of the last defenses. Once it falters, the dungeon wins completely. Archaeologists have discovered tally marks cut not into walls but into the wooden beams of doors, hundreds of lines, some overlapping wildly. They believe these are evidence of minds unraveling, men carving and recarving, in desperation to hold on to something as simple as a count. It didn't matter if the numbers were wrong. The act of marking became proof that time still existed. You imagine doing the same, scraping until fingernails broke, just to insist that one more moment had passed. A peculiar anecdote survives from Spanish chronicles. Prisoners whispered that the dungeon could steal thoughts. They claimed stone absorbed ideas the way it absorbed screams, leaving captives blank. Guards mocked them, but the stories spread, turning loss of memory into a supernatural fear. Today, psychologists might call it trauma. Back then, it was simply called haunting. You lean forward, trying to steady your mind, and find yourself muttering aloud. Simple words, nonsense phrases, anything to anchor yourself. Captives did the same, reciting prayers, lists of family members, even recipes. A French rebel once recorded that he repeated the Our Father more than 1,000 times a day. It was not piety alone, it was survival, a rope tied around sanity. You whisper your own words now, though you don't even recognize them. They feel borrowed, as though someone else speaks through your lips. The darkness presses harder. You see flickers, shapes forming just at the edge of vision. A figure crouched in the corner. A flicker of flame dancing across stone. You blink, and nothing is there. These too are well documented. Medieval accounts describe visions both holy and terrifying. Some swore angels appeared, wings glowing with light. Others swore they saw demons crawling from cracks, claws dragging across their skin. Modern researchers argue dehydration and sleeplessness created hallucinations, but the prisoners themselves never doubted. For them, the visions were real. One peculiar carving found in the dungeons of Bologna shows a horned face etched carefully beside a cross. Was it protection or memory of a nightmare? Scholars still argue. You think of it now as you glance at walls, half expecting to see faces emerge from moss. Your pulse quickens, not because they are real, but because you cannot be sure they are not. And then comes the worst moment. You forget yourself. Just briefly, but enough. Your name slips from your mind like water through fingers. You reach for it, panic rising, until it returns, ragged and faint. Captives once described this too, the terror of forgetting their own identities. Some scratch names endlessly into stone, desperate to hold on. You whisper yours aloud, again and again, until the syllables sound foreign. The dungeon has turned you into a stranger to yourself. Specialists remain divided on whether madness was the dungeon's primary aim or merely a side effect. Some argue rulers preferred confessions born of broken minds. Others insist insanity was unintended, that captivity alone sufficed. But as your thoughts unravel, intent feels irrelevant. Madness is here, creeping like frost through your skull, regardless of plan. A curious superstition emerges again. Prisoners believed madness was contagious. They swore that hearing another captive mutter nonsense could infect the listener. Some begged to be kept alone, not from cruelty, but from fear of catching insanity. Whether this was belief or desperate excuse, it speaks to the fragility of minds already stretched too thin. You stumble forward again, muttering words under your breath, though they no longer connect. The rhythm comforts you, syllables clicking like footsteps. Yet you know this is only the beginning. Another night without sleep, another hour without food, another draft through cracks, and your thoughts will dissolve completely. You pause, clutching your chest, and laugh suddenly, though nothing is funny. The sound startles you. It echoes oddly, warped into a stranger's laugh. Captives once described the same uncontrollable fits of laughter in the dark. Some claimed it was hysteria. Others believed demons tickled their ribs. Either way, the laughter brought no joy. It was proof of unraveling. Above, scholars debate theology in universities. Monks illuminate manuscripts. Poets compose verses of reason. Below, you babble nonsense in shadows, your words unmoored. The contrast is unbearable, and yet perfectly medieval. The castle displays civilization above, barbarity below. You stumble once more, your legs nearly folding, your thoughts fractured. You realize why no one lasts a night here. The dungeon doesn't only break the body, it dismantles the mind. It strips you of certainty, of memory, of self, until you are nothing but whispers in the dark, scratching names you no longer remember onto walls you cannot see. You sink to your knees, forehead pressed against stone, muttering a prayer you cannot finish. The words drift away before they reach your lips. And in that silence, you understand, madness here is not an accident. It is the dungeon's final chain. You slump against the wall, your forehead pressed to stone, slick with condensation. For a while, you remain there, hardly moving, almost convinced you have turned into part of the dungeon itself. But then, faintly, comes another intrusion, not sound this time, but scent. You wrinkle your nose as a sour odor wafts past, sharp enough to pierce even the heavy dampness of the air. At first you think it is more mildew, but then the smell strengthens, curdled and unmistakable. Rot. You shift forward, following it reluctantly, and your boots splash into something softer than water. You crouch, fingertips grazing clumps that yield like clay. It is straw again, but fouled, blackened, soaked not only with waste but with something stickier. You withdraw your hand, shuddering. In some cells, prisoners were forced to relieve themselves exactly where they lay. There were no buckets, no drains, only piles that grew rank until they seemed to breathe. Contemporary records describe this bluntly: they sat in filth until filth devoured them. Archaeologists have excavated such layers in forgotten cells, sediment compacted by centuries, pungent even today when exposed. Beneath castle floors they have found waste mingled with bones, proof of neglect so thorough that prisoners and refuse became indistinguishable. You think of that as you rise again, your cloak clinging damply to your knees, and the image nearly buckles your resolve. One curious testimony from a Florentine rebel describes how straw heaps sometimes fermented with heat. In winter, men pressed closer to them for warmth, despite the stench. "Better stink than frost," he wrote, though his words drip with shame. The contradiction captures perfectly the dungeon's cruelty. To survive meant degrading yourself, embracing filth as ally. You wonder if you too would huddle into waste just to feel warmth on frozen skin. Specialists remain divided on whether sanitation was deliberately withheld as punishment or whether dungeons were simply too neglected for maintenance. Some argue that latrines were accessible but denied to certain prisoners. Others insist that cleaning such spaces was never priority, especially for the poor or forgotten. Regardless of debate, the outcome is clear. Filth multiplied until it defined existence. You shuffle deeper, gagging at the odor. Each breath tastes sour, like spoiled milk mixed with rust. You imagine lungs coated with it, each inhale poisoning from within. Prisoners often succumb to disease here: dysentery, fevers, infections spreading rapidly. Written accounts describe entire groups of captives falling ill, the stench of sickness mingling with that of rot. Guards sometimes abandoned cells entirely, leaving them sealed with the dying inside. You picture that horror, an entire chamber becoming its own tomb, voices fading one by one until silence reigned again. And yet, oddly, some prisoners carved prayers into these very walls, pleading for forgiveness while surrounded by filth. Their words show that even in degradation, faith persisted. One scratched verse from England reads simply, "God sees, even here." The defiance is almost luminous, though carved into stone smeared with waste. A peculiar superstition whispered among captives claimed that spirits lingered in straw. They believed that when men died unconfessed, their souls soaked into bedding, haunting others who lay upon it. Some refused to sleep, fearing the restless dead. Others embraced the idea, whispering to the straw as though speaking to companions. Was this madness, or an attempt to humanize surroundings otherwise unbearable? Scholars hesitate to decide, but the detail is haunting. You edge along the wall now, boots slipping in sludge. Each step releases new odors, acrid and suffocating. You cough violently, your ribs aching with effort. Your eyes water, blurring the stone until it shimmers. In this moment you realize how filth is not merely discomfort but weapon. It weakens the body with infection, but it also assaults dignity. It convinces you that you are less than human, more beast than man. Travelers' tales mention guards mocking captives for this. They taunted them as swine, tossing scraps into filth, laughing at the spectacle. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories ring true in spirit. The dungeon did not need to whip when degradation worked more deeply. You stagger, your hand slipping against the wall. When you pull it back, your palm shines with slime. You wipe it on your cloak, but the stain remains, tacky against skin. For a heartbeat you nearly weep, not from pain, but from humiliation. To be reduced to this, touching rot, smelling decay, breathing poison, it strips pride more thoroughly than chains. Archaeologists confirm that such humiliation left marks. Human remains from dungeon pits often show teeth filed down by grinding men gnawing in stress or desperation. Others bear nails bitten to stubs. These details speak louder than grand chronicles. Lives worn down by endless filth, broken not only in body but in spirit. And yet, curiously, resilience surfaces even here. A prisoner's note from Spain, written after release, described how he survived by pretending filth was medicine. He told himself the foul odors were purging sins, the vermin teaching humility. Was this delusion? Perhaps, but it kept him alive. The mind will invent any story, however absurd, to endure one more night. You step onward, though your stomach churns and bile rises. Every breath is foul, yet you cannot escape it. The dungeon is saturated with rot. Even if you climb stairs now, the stench would cling to you for days, embedded in hair and clothes. Perhaps this too was intentional, so that even freed captives carried the dungeon with them, marked forever by its odor. Above, nobles dined in perfumed halls, fragrant with incense and roses. Below, you choke on rot, lips cracked, throat raw. The contrast mocks you more viciously than hunger. And so you keep walking, though you know filth will not leave you. It seeps into pores, memory, soul. The dungeon ensures you never rise fully clean again. One night here is impossible not only because of cold or thirst or madness. It is impossible because filth makes you forget humanity itself. And once you forget, the dungeon has already won. You move carefully now, every step sticky with foulness, but soon another sound intrudes on your misery. At first it is faint, a muffled chuckle, the scrape of something metallic, but then it grows clearer. Laughter, not the warm laughter of friends by a fire, but sharp, mocking, edged with cruelty. You freeze, knowing instinctively that it does not belong to prisoners. It belongs to the men above you, the keepers of keys. Medieval records describe this dynamic often. Guards held immense power not only through rations and chains, but through derision. Captives depended on them for every crumb of survival, and that dependence became its own theatre. Guards did not need to strike, they only needed to laugh. That laughter reminded you that your suffering was entertainment. One prisoner from Milan wrote bitterly that he feared the guards' smiles more than their whips. Whips ended quickly, but smiles lingered, cutting pride deeper than lashes ever could. You understand his words now, as the sound echoes downward, carrying with it not warmth but humiliation. The laughter grows, punctuated by a metallic jingle. Keys. You imagine them dangling from belts, clinking with each step. Each key is potential salvation, yet each key remains out of reach. Captives once described dreaming of keys nightly, their shapes burned into memory. But in reality, keys rarely freed. They locked tighter, reminding you that your fate rested in indifferent hands. One curious anecdote from Paris describes guards dropping keys deliberately into sight of prisoners, then retrieving them with a smirk. The gesture was not meant to tempt escape, It was meant to mock hope itself. Imagine reaching through bars, desperate fingers brushing iron, only for laughter to follow as the key is withdrawn. That memory stings worse than hunger. You hear footsteps now, boots striking rhythmically as guards approach. A glow rises 2 torches. The light grows nearer until 2 figures emerge, faces shadowed by helmets. They stop outside your chamber. You squint, shielding your eyes, because even this meager flame blinds you after so much dark. One guard holds a bucket. He tips it lazily, sloshing water onto the ground, but none near you. The liquid seeps into cracks, tantalizing, unreachable. You lunge instinctively, but he only laughs, retreating a step. The other guard tosses something into straw, a crust of bread, mold blooming green. He chuckles as you stare at it. The food is almost inedible, yet your stomach snarls with hunger. Their mockery is complete. They offer what you crave, but in forms designed to shame. Historical records confirm this ritual of cruelty. Captives wrote of guards spitting into bowls before sliding them into cells. Others described them throwing bones gnawed clean, daring prisoners to chew marrowless scraps. Was this universal practice? Scholars debate. But the sheer consistency of testimonies suggests it happened often enough to leave scars on memory. You crouch, trembling, torn between dignity and desperation. Do you eat the moldy crust? Do you lap at the water creeping through cracks? Guards watch with smirks, waiting. Their amusement depends on your humiliation. That is the final cruelty. You become part of their game. A peculiar superstition once circulated among prisoners. They believed guards who mocked too cruelly were cursed to carry dungeon echoes into their dreams. Some swore that tormentors screamed in their sleep, haunted by laughter they once used as weapon. Whether folklore or wishful thinking, the story reflects desperate hope that justice existed somewhere beyond stone. The guards move on, their boots receding, their torches shrinking into black. The laughter lingers, though. It rings inside your skull, replaying endlessly. You realize the dungeon does not need to speak. The guards provide its voice. Their indifference, their jeers, their dangling of hope, this is punishment refined. Archaeologists occasionally uncover trinkets in guard chambers above. Dice, cups, playing boards. These artifacts remind us that while prisoners starved below, keepers played games, drank ale, rolled bones to pass the time. Life above and below the same walls existed in grotesque parallel. You slump against stone, your body shuddering. Your pride feels more tattered than your cloak. Hunger gnaws harder now, but shame gnaws harder still. You replay the smirk on the guard's face, the careless toss of mouldy bread. The memory humiliates you more than filth, more than chains, because it proves you are no longer human in their eyes. You are spectacle. Specialists in medieval justice debate whether cruelty from guards was sanctioned or merely tolerated. Some lords may have forbidden excessive torment, yet rarely enforced such rules. Others turned a blind eye, or perhaps even encouraged mockery as deterrence. The written laws remain vague, leaving historians divided. But here in the dungeon, legal arguments do not matter. What matters is the echo of laughter, sharper than any whip crack. And now you understand another reason no one survives a night here. It isn't only deprivation or cold, it's humiliation. It's knowing that above you, men treat your suffering as comedy. It's feeling pride, drain away with every smirk, until even scraps feel like insults. Above, nobles laugh at jesters in gilded halls. Below, guards laugh at you. Both kinds of laughter echo. Only one kills. You curl tighter into yourself, closing your eyes, trying to block out memory of keys and smirks. But the sound lingers, louder than screams, sharper than silence. And you realize, laughter in the dungeon is never joy. It is cruelty, and it is endless. The guard's laughter fades, but the damage lingers. Even in silence, you hear it replaying, warped and echoing as though the dungeon itself is mocking you. You try to steady your breath, but another weight presses down time. or rather the absence of it. You realize you have no idea how long you've been here. Hours, days, a single endless night. Without sun, without bells, without any measure of passing, you drift inside a void where time itself collapses. Captives once wrote bitterly of this disorientation. One English prisoner confessed that he mistook nights for weeks and weeks for months. Another in Burgundy claimed he counted what he thought were 40 days, only to be told upon release that only a fortnight had passed. Scholars remain divided about whether exaggeration inflated these accounts, but they agree on the principle. The dungeon erases time as surely as it erases warmth. You press your palm to the wall and try to count heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, then. You lose track, distracted by dripping water. You try again, but each attempt dissolves. You wonder how many prisoners did the same, clinging to rhythm as substitute for clocks. Archaeologists have found tally scratches in clusters, sometimes abandoned halfway. Perhaps the carver lost patience, or perhaps madness stole numbers from their mind. Either way, the tally marks stand as broken calendars of the forgotten. A curious superstition emerges in the annals of Naples. Prisoners believed the dungeon had its own calendar. They claimed the dripping water-marked days, each echo a tick of time. Some swore they could hear patterns within the drips, whispering of weeks and months. Was this truth, delusion, or desperate invention? Historians hesitate. But in your silence now, the thought feels strangely believable. You shuffle forward and stumble into a corner. The straw here is pressed flat, as though many bodies once curled in the same spot. Scratched into the stone above it are circles, overlapping, messy, moons. You realize some prisoner tried to carve phases of the lunar cycle, despite never seeing the sky. He must have guessed, imagining moons waxing and waning in darkness. You trace one crescent with a finger, and the absurdity aches. He invented a night sky underground, because the real one had been stolen. Modern psychologists would call this coping a way to impose order when reality denies it. Medieval chroniclers had no such term. They simply noted that prisoners often spoke of suns and moons as though they had seen them. They laughed at the delusion, not understanding it was survival. You slump down, knees cracking, and close your eyes. In the absence of markers, your body becomes clock. Hunger strikes as hours, thirst as minutes, shivering as seconds. But even these measures falter when exhaustion blurs sensation. You cannot tell whether your stomach aches from hunger or from illness, whether your limbs shake from cold or from sheer fatigue. The dungeon robs you of every reference point until you float in a void. A peculiar anecdote survives from Bohemian folklore. It tells of a prisoner who believed he had slept for years, only to wake unchanged. He swore the dungeon stopped aging, trapping men in eternal night. Some villagers even whispered that dungeons were gates to purgatory, places where time paused to punish. Was this superstition or observation twisted by despair? Either way, the story shows how deeply time weighed or failed to weigh on captives. You open your eyes again and stare into blackness. Your mind begins to invent rhythms. You think you hear footsteps marking minutes, though no one comes. You think you feel drafts timed like hours, though they are irregular. You wonder if the dungeon is training you into its own clock, teaching you that time here does not belong to the sun or moon but to stone. Archaeologists sometimes find remains of wax stubs deep underground, evidence that some prisoners once lit candles. A candle might burn an hour, maybe two. For those lucky enough to possess one, wax became calendar. When the candle died, so did the measure of time. You imagine clutching such a stub, watching flame shrink, terrified not of darkness but of losing the only marker left. And then comes another horror. Memory itself begins to slip. Without time, you cannot place events. Did you eat yesterday or last week? Did you hear screams an hour ago or a lifetime ago? Captives wrote of forgetting their own crimes, even their own names. Some emerged from dungeons unable to say why they had been imprisoned at all. Scholars argue whether this was trauma or deliberate denial, but the truth seems simple. Without time, identity erodes. One prisoner in Germany carved his own name 200 times on a wall, each accompanied by a date. The dates are inconsistent, overlapping impossibly. To modern eyes, it looks like madness. But perhaps it was not madness, it was rebellion, an insistence that time still moved, even if falsely. You press your forehead to the wall, whispering your own name again, as though repetition can anchor you. But the syllables feel foreign, drifting further from meaning each time. The dungeon unmoors even language, stretching it until words dissolve into noise. Specialists remain divided on whether this loss of time was calculated cruelty or simple accident of architecture. Some argue that nobles preferred prisoners broken by confusion. Others insist that no one thought about it, that the dark was simply dark. But standing here, unmoored, you know intent hardly matters. The outcome is the same. You stagger upright, though your legs resist. You walk onward, each step meaningless because you no longer know where you began or where you end. The dungeon does not need clocks to torment you. It makes you its own sundial, its own hourglass, bleeding you minute by minute until nothing remains. Above, bells mark hours, monks chant prayers at set times, calendars turn pages with certainty. Below, you drown in timeless dark, your life measured only by the sound of your own weakening breath. And now you understand. One night here is not truly one night at all. It is eternity compressed into hours, infinity hidden in darkness. You would not last because there is no night to last. There is only endlessness, and in endlessness, you vanish. You stagger onward, though now the question of time gnaws at you more savagely than hunger. If you cannot measure hours, if you cannot trace days, then how do you know you still live? Perhaps you already died, and this wandering is eternity. The thought unsettles you, and your chest tightens with panic. You pause, forcing a breath, and it is then you hear it dripping again. Not the gentle drip of water you heard before, but heavier, irregular, striking stone with a dull splatter. You edge closer, guided by sound. Your boots slide against slickness. You kneel, touch the floor, and your fingers come away sticky. You lift them hesitantly to your nose. The odor is sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Blood. Medieval chronicles sometimes describe dungeons not only as prisons but as storage for punishment's residue. After interrogations, after executions, after beatings, blood was left to soak into stone. Cleaning was rare. Guards rarely cared. Records from German castles speak bluntly of floors that ran red for days. Archaeologists have found discolorations in some chambers, patches of stone darkened permanently. Scholars debate whether these are indeed bloodstains or merely mineral deposits. The argument matters little when you crouch here, fingertips tacky with imagined iron tang. A peculiar anecdote from Italy describes prisoners forced to remain in cells where others had bled before them. The stench, they wrote, was worse than vermin. It haunted even dreams, because the odor reminded them constantly of violence they had not seen but could smell. And you know instantly what they meant, for the reek here fills your nose until it seems your lungs drink iron. You stumble back, wiping fingers against your cloak, but the stain remains. You feel as though the dungeon itself has marked you. That too was once believed. Captives in Spain whispered that stone drank blood, and never released it. They said walls grew hungrier with each drop, demanding more. Folklore, perhaps, but when you gaze at dark patches under torchless black, the notion feels disturbingly plausible. You press onward, though unease stiffens your steps. Soon another detail catches your eyes, scratches deeper than graffiti, grooves that look like they were carved not with tools but with desperate force. You trace one, long and jagged, across stone. It is not writing, it is clawing. A prisoner, chained perhaps, dragging nails against wall until they split. Archaeologists have indeed found such markings, ragged and irregular, carved too low for convenience. They are not words. They are screams etched in silence. One chilling testimony from a French dungeon describes prisoners driven to claw their own arms until skin tore, as though transferring agony to walls. Did madness cause this, or was it a final attempt at control? Scholars still debate. You imagine the sound, the scrape of nail against stone, ragged and relentless, and your own hands twitch involuntarily. The dungeon offers another cruelty. Smell never dissipates. Even centuries later, chambers reek of damp, rust, waste. When mixed with blood, the scent becomes unforgettable. Monks who visited dungeons to offer last rites often wrote that they gagged instantly, unable to continue prayers without cloth pressed to their faces. Imagine then how it felt for prisoners chained inside, forced to inhale endlessly. You breathe shallowly now, but it doesn't matter. The metallic tang clings. And then comes sound again. A faint drip resumes, steady this time, but your mind twists it into rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. You lean close, listening, and for a moment you believe it is not water dripping but blood, still falling, eternally renewed. Captives once described the same illusion. They claimed dungeons bled forever, as if stone itself opened wounds at night. Scholars dismiss such lines as poetic exaggeration. Yet in darkness, with sticky odor in your nose, the metaphor becomes too sharp to ignore. You stumble into another chamber and discover something worse. Chains dangle from the ceiling here, their ends rusted and bent. Beneath them lies a depression in stone, as if carved by weight pressing endlessly. It is easy to imagine men or women suspended, blood pooling below, each drop etching deeper into floor. Whether such punishments were common or rare remains debated. But the sight of that depression speaks louder than argument. Stone itself remembers weight. A peculiar superstition spread among prisoners held in such places. They said those chained overhead never truly left. When the body died, the shadow remained, swaying silently from ceiling. Other captives avoided looking up, terrified of glimpsing outlines still dangling in dark. Was this madness, or truth glimpsed at the edge of fear? You hesitate now to raise your head, half afraid of what shadows you might see. You turn instead toward the floor, only to notice stains spreading outward like veins. Moisture has seeped, forming patterns disturbingly organic. You close your eyes, but the imagery remains. The dungeon as a body, its veins filled with centuries of blood. Perhaps this is why chroniclers spoke of living stone. The dungeon is not only container, it is participant. You kneel once more, hand brushing a groove worn smooth. For a moment you imagine someone clutching it, fingers bloodied, trying to steady themselves as life drained away. The thought sickens you, but also roots you in history. You realize you are not merely imagining conditions, you are reliving what hundreds before you endured. And then, faintly, you hear another echo. Not a scream this time, but a groan. Long, drawn out, vibrating through walls. It could be stone shifting. It could be memory replaying. Or it could be your own mind, projecting agony into cracks. Captives once wrote of this too, describing walls that moaned with sorrow. Some claimed the sound was prayer, others claimed it was lament. Either way, it convinced them the dungeon itself wept blood. Specialists argue still whether tales of blood-soaked chambers are exaggerations fueled by later Gothic imagination. Some dismiss them as legends crafted to vilify tyrants. Others point to physical evidence, stained floors, rusted chains, grooves, arguing these cannot be dismissed as myth. The debate remains unresolved. But here, in your imagining, the debate doesn't matter. Your senses decide for you. You smell iron. You feel sticky stone. You hear drips. That is enough. Above, nobles spill wine across tables, red liquid glistening on wood. They laugh, wipe stains with linen. Below, red stains remain forever, unwiped, unspeakable. You press your back to wall, trembling, and close your eyes. But the dungeon offers no relief. The stains are still there, whether or not you look. The odor clings, whether or not you breathe. And now you know. One night here is impossible not only because of cold, hunger, thirst, or madness. It is impossible because you cannot share space with centuries of blood and remain whole. You would unravel simply by standing, by smelling, by remembering. The dungeon does not need to harm you directly. It only needs to show you what harm already happened here, and that is enough to undo you. You stagger away from the chamber with its sticky floor, heart pounding as though the dungeon itself has marked you with memory. But no matter how far you walk, the odor clings to your nostrils. Worse still, you realize something new has joined the smell smoke. Faint, acrid, ghost-like. You freeze, tasting char on your tongue. Was something burned here long ago? Or is it only your imagination? Medieval chronicles sometimes describe fire not as warmth, but as torment. Dungeons were not always places of cold alone. They were also arenas for smoke, flame, and suffocation. Some prisoners wrote of being half-cooked by heat in enclosed chambers, their skin blistering before air itself turned unbreathable. Others described braziers carried into cells, the glowing coals used not only for interrogation but to thicken the air with choking fumes. You cough now, involuntarily, though the smoke is barely there. Your throat burns at the suggestion, and your mind supplies what the air does not. Vision of flames licking straw, of smoke rolling low across stone. A peculiar account from Prague tells of captives forced to sit in sealed rooms where damp straw smouldered for hours, the choking haze breaking wills faster than whips. Historians still argue whether this was routine practice or rare cruelty. Yet the testimonies echo with consistency, and you begin to understand how easily smoke could undo you here. Archaeologists in Italy uncovered braziers rusted through, found deep in subterranean chambers. Were they used to warm guards on cold nights or to torment captives below? The evidence speaks ambiguously, but context suggests more sinister use. And when you inhale now, feeling lungs ache, the answer feels certain. You stumble forward, hand against wall, and the air shifts again. A stronger draft pushes through, but this time it carries not only cold, it carries ash. You lick your lips and taste grit. You cough, doubling over, and the sound echoes harshly. Whether real or imagined, the sensation convinces you. This dungeon once held fire, and its ghost still burns. A peculiar superstition circulated among prisoners. They believed smoke carried voices of the condemned. Some swore they saw shapes in haze, shadows of men burned long ago. A monk, writing in the 15th century, claimed he entered a dungeon to give last rites, and saw faces form in the smoke of torches, whispering. Scholars dismiss the account as hysteria, but even they admit smoke plays tricks on vision. In dark, where air is heavy, shadows easily become figures. You straighten slowly, throat raw, eyes watering. You imagine captives shackled in corners, coughing endlessly as smoke filled lungs. The dungeon did not need to set them aflame, it needed only to fill the chamber until breath itself was impossible. Accounts from Spain describe prisoners begging for chains to be undone so they could wave smoke away. Guards refused. Suffocation was spectacle, a quiet cruelty requiring no blade. Specialists remain divided on whether fire was used more often for punishment or intimidation. Some argue flame was too valuable to waste underground. Others insist the psychological power outweighed cost. Whatever the truth, here in shadow you sense how easily flame could shift from tool to torment. You press on, but the thought of fire trails behind. Every draught feels hotter now, though you know it is cold. Every flicker of shadow seems like ember, though you know no torch burns. The dungeon has planted new phantoms inside you, ghosts of smoke, ghosts of suffocation. And then you stumble into another chamber, and your boots strike something brittle. You crouch, fingers brushing fragments. They crumble instantly, leaving dust on your hands. Charcoal, bones blackened into ash. You pull back sharply, chest heaving. Perhaps it is only burned wood, but your mind whispers another possibility. Archaeologists have indeed found calcined bone fragments in castle basements. Some suggest these were animal remains discarded down shafts. Others wonder if they belonged to men. Scholars argue still, but here in dark, the debate feels academic. The dust on your skin tells you enough. A peculiar tale from German folklore claims that spirits of those burned below wandered castles eternally, their shadows twisting in torchlight. Guards told these stories to frighten one another, perhaps even to excuse cruelty. The dungeon demands fire, or it grows restless. Whether true or not, the smell of ash convinces you there is truth buried somewhere in the legend. You wipe your hands against cloak, leaving streaks of grey. The dust clings like accusation. You rise, coughing again, and realize your chest aches not from real smoke but from memory of it. Yet memory alone suffices. Even imagining one night breathing such air feels impossible. Above, nobles warmed themselves by fires, their halls glowing with hearths. Below, fire twisted into something opposite: suffocation, darkness, torment. Two worlds, two flames, one comfort, one cruelty. You press forward again, though your body protests. The dungeon does not relent. Even when fire is absent, it remains as ghost in your lungs, ghost in your imagination. That is enough. And now you understand. One night here is impossible not only because of cold, hunger, thirst, vermin, or silence. It is impossible because even the element meant to comfort fire becomes enemy. The dungeon twists every gift of the world above. Food becomes insult, water becomes filth, air becomes poison, fire becomes torment. What remains for you to endure? Nothing but stone. And stone, patient and merciless, endures longer than you ever could. You wipe the grey dust from your hands, but it clings stubbornly to your skin, as if the dungeon refuses to let go. The air grows heavier with each breath, your lungs working harder, and a dull ache spreads in your temples. You pause, pressing fingers to your forehead. It is then you notice something else. The air here is thinner. Breathing feels not only painful but insufficient, as though each inhale delivers less life than the last. Captives once wrote of this suffocating atmosphere. Some described it as air that does not feed. Others said it was like drinking shadows. Historians remain uncertain whether this was exaggeration or literal lack of oxygen in cramped, unventilated chambers. Modern archaeologists, examining the depths of certain castles, discovered cells so poorly ventilated that air exchange was almost non-existent. In such spaces, fires extinguished quickly, torches sputtered out, and men gasped for hours until unconsciousness claimed them. You shuffle onward, each breath shallow. The sensation grows more sinister as dizziness sets in. Your balance falters, and the walls seem to sway. You brace yourself, but the stone feels alive, pulsing faintly under your palm. A hallucination, surely, but a convincing one. You realize that lack of air does more than weaken muscles. It distorts perception, makes shadows bend, makes silence hum. One peculiar note from a Venetian prisoner describes how he heard music underground, soft and lilting, though no musicians were near. He swore flutes played in the darkness. Later, scholars dismissed this as hallucination caused by poor air, but his account captures the truth. Suffocation births illusions. You feel it too. Somewhere faintly, you almost hear a hum, a low tone like monks chanting far away. You stumble, knees buckling. The dungeon tilts violently before your eyes. For a moment you are sure you will fall flat, but you catch yourself against the wall. Your breath comes ragged now, chest heaving, yet no relief follows. This is the cruelty of bad air. You may breathe until lungs ache, but still feel starved. Prison records confirm how many perished this way. Some died, not from chains or hunger, but from atmosphere itself. Chroniclers wrote that men faded like candles, their flames smothered slowly by air that refused to nourish. Bones unearthed centuries later reveal no wounds, no clear cause of death, leaving only mystery. Scholars debate still. Was it disease or suffocation or despair? The answer may be all three. A superstition grew among captives. They claimed the dungeon itself stole breath. They whispered that the stone consumed oxygen as greedily as fire, leaving none for men. Guards mocked this idea, but even some keepers admitted cells grew stifling if left sealed too long. They avoided lingering, while prisoners had no choice. You now understand why such a belief took root. When every breath feels stolen, superstition becomes explanation. You crouch low, head between knees, trying to draw air more deeply. Your lungs expand, but dizziness only increases. You feel faint, your vision narrowing until blackness creeps at edges. Perhaps this is how prisoners collapsed. Not screaming, not fighting, but simply sliding quietly into unconsciousness. Chroniclers noted that such deaths appeared peaceful but only from the outside. From the inside, it must have felt like drowning without water. Archaeologists in France uncovered skulls arranged strangely in certain dungeon corners. Some experts believe prisoners crawled together for warmth. Others suggest they sought spots where air seemed better, pressing close to cracks or vents. Theories diverge, but all point to one truth. Men fought for breath as much as for food. You raise your head again, gasping. Sweat beads on your brow despite the cold. That is the paradox of suffocation. It burns inside even while air outside freezes. Your throat rasps. Your chest rattles. You wonder how much longer you can last before darkness wins. Then, faintly, a draught passes again, carrying with it faint relief. You inhale greedily, ignoring the stench it carries. For a moment your head clears. But hope is cruel. The draught shifts, fades, leaving you once again with air too heavy to sustain. The fluctuation itself torments you, because it proves breath exists, yet denies consistency. A curious anecdote from Poland recounts prisoners who measured their lives by draughts. Each whisper of moving air was a reprieve, each lull a sentence. One captive claimed he survived months by praying only for gusts. Whether literal or imagined, the story shows how breath became currency. You feel the same desperation, clinging to each gasp as if it were treasure. And then comes the final horror. The dungeon convinces you the air itself is hostile. You find yourself suspicious of each inhale, wondering if it poisons rather than sustains. Some prisoners wrote of tasting rot in every breath, certain that fumes carried death. Modern researchers suggest methane and mold may indeed have contaminated cells. Whether poison or paranoia, the effect is the same. Breath itself becomes enemy. You press onward, though your steps wobble. You count them as distraction. 1, 2, 3. The numbers blur, but the act gives rhythm to your faltering lungs. You wonder how many captives used counting as shield, whispering numbers to themselves, hoping the ritual delayed collapse. Above, nobles breathe incense, sweet wine, perfumed air. Below, you choke on stagnation, your lungs laboring as though chained. The contrast is grotesque, but perfectly medieval. The castle as monument to both comfort and cruelty, divided only by floors. You stumble once more, nearly falling, but manage to brace against the wall. Your chest heaves violently, then stills. For a long moment you hear nothing but pounding in ears, and you realize with bone-deep certainty you could not last a night breathing like this. Not because the dungeon strangles you directly, but because it convinces you with every gasp that you are already suffocating. The dungeon requires no rope, no blade. It has patience. It kills by air alone. Your lungs ache as though scraped raw, but somehow you keep moving, dragging one foot after the other. And then you begin to notice another truth of the dungeon, one that arrives slowly, like a shadow creeping along the floor. Loneliness. It is heavier than chains, more suffocating than foul air. For though you have heard echoes and laughter, screams and sobs, the truth is you are alone. You are trapped not only in stone but inside yourself. Captives once wrote of this solitude more bitterly than of hunger. One English rebel, chained in the tower, confessed that he longed even for the company of his enemies. Another in Italy said he prayed not for food but for another voice, even if it cursed me. Historians remark often on these pleas. surprised that companionship mattered more than bread. But here, in darkness, the fact is obvious. Solitude gnaws like teeth. You sit down hard on the damp floor, listening to your own breath. It sounds hollow, pitiful. You whisper a word aloud, only to hear it thrown back at you by walls, warped and strange. Echo is not company. Echo is mockery. You close your eyes, and in silence you almost feel yourself fading. Without another to see you, are you truly there? Archaeologists have uncovered scratchings that prove how prisoners fought this fear. Inscriptions often include not just names but dialogues, two voices carved in exchange, though it is clear only one hand made them. A prisoner pretended to hold conversation with himself, carving questions and answers. "How fare you?" one line reads. "Cold," replies the next. "Hungry," says another. Whether madness or clever survival, the intent is plain: to resist erasure by inventing witness. A peculiar superstition grew from this need. Some captives believed rats carried messages between souls. They whispered to vermin as though to companions, even naming them. One German chronicle notes a man who carved the name of his favorite rat beside his own, calling it brother. Whether true or invention, the story captures desperation perfectly. Alone, you invent kinship with whatever lives nearby. You glance around, half hoping to hear scurrying. At least it would mean you were not entirely alone. But now there is only silence. Solitude presses like stone on your chest. Your thoughts begin to wander toward memory faces of family, friends, strangers in streets. They appear vivid at first, then blur. The dungeon steals not only presence but recollection. Without fresh memory to feed them, the images decay. You see your mother's face, then cannot recall the exact curve of her mouth. You whisper her name, but even that sounds uncertain. Loneliness robs even memory of warmth. One prisoner in France left behind a desperate carving, "Do not forget me." It was not plea to God, but to the world above, to anyone who might remember he had lived. That is the terror of solitude, not dying but vanishing. You feel it now, heavy as chains. You rise again, legs trembling, and stagger deeper. Your voice bursts out suddenly, unplanned. "Is anyone there?" The words echo, return, mock. No reply. You laugh bitterly at yourself, though it comes out more like sob. Captives did the same, shouting into void just to hear sound, though they knew no answer would come. Scholars remain divided about whether solitary confinement was deliberate punishment or simple neglect. Some argue dungeons were too cramped for multiple prisoners, so men languished alone by default. Others insist isolation was intentional, a weapon designed to unravel minds. Both may be true, but intent matters little. The effect is the same: loneliness becomes its own torment. A curious anecdote from Venice tells of a prisoner who swore he heard voices from beneath the floor. He conversed with them daily, though no evidence proved anyone was ever there. Was it hallucination? Was it echo? Or was it invention, a mind-fabricating company to survive? Historians cannot decide, but you begin to understand how easily you too might conjure such phantoms. Already, you half hear whispers that are not yours. You pause, leaning against stone. A tear slides down your cheek, though you hardly notice. Loneliness strips even crying of meaning. There is no one to see, no one to comfort, no one to mock. Your grief is private, which makes it heavier. Archaeologists have found bones curled tightly in corners, skeletons hunched as though still clutching themselves. Perhaps the prisoners died from cold, perhaps from hunger. But the posture speaks of something deeper. They died, folded inward, alone. That loneliness fossilized, preserved for centuries. You whisper again, softer now. "I am here." The words are almost swallowed before they leave your lips. You repeat them not to call anyone, but to prove to yourself that you still exist. It is a ritual, fragile but vital. Perhaps others before you did the same. Perhaps the dungeon has been filled for centuries with quiet declarations of selfhood, whispered into stone. Above, nobles gather in halls filled with voices, debates, laughter, quarrels, songs. They drown in company, sometimes longing for silence. Below, you drown in silence, longing for company. The contrast is crueler than chains. You rise once more, though knees shake. You walk on, whispering names into the dark. Some belong to family, some to strangers. Some are names you invent, companions conjured from desperation. They do not answer, but the sound of syllables comforts you for moments at least. And in those moments you understand. One night here is impossible not only because of hunger or thirst, but because of loneliness. Humans are not meant to live unobserved. To vanish unseen is to vanish twice. The dungeon kills not only body and mind, it kills witness. You pause, touching wall one last time, and imagine thousands of other hands before you. Perhaps they too whispered names, hoping to be remembered. And in that thought lies faint solace. You are not the only one who felt this. But solace does not last. Loneliness returns, heavier still. You walk on, carrying silence inside you, knowing it will not break. Not tonight. Not ever. Your whispered names trail off into darkness, and once more you are left with only your own breath. But soon you realize there is another companion here, one that cannot be ignored. Hunger. It creeps not suddenly, but with the persistence of a worm burrowing through wood. At first, you notice only faint growls in your belly. Then the growls sharpen into cramps, twisting muscle into knots. Soon your entire body feels hollow, as if stone has scooped you out from within. Captives wrote often of hunger, though their words sometimes sound almost polite. We were given crusts, one man wrote, but they were more insult than sustenance. Others were more direct. I ate straw. I ate leather. I chewed my own shoes. Historians who read these accounts sometimes doubt the extremity, but archaeologists have uncovered gnawed bones and leather scraps with human bite marks in dungeon refuse pits. The evidence leaves little room for denial. You crouch, clutching your stomach, and imagine gnawing at your own cloak. The fabric smells of mildew, gritty against your teeth. You spit it out, gagging. And yet you understand why others persisted. To chew anything is to pretend the body still matters. A peculiar tale from Germany describes prisoners boiling shoes into broth, scraping softened leather with teeth. Another from Spain tells of straw twisted into knots and swallowed, though it bloated bellies more than it nourished. Scholars argue whether these were rare cases or common, but the variety of desperate foods, grass, rats, candle wax suggests hunger drove many to experiment with the inedible. You glance downward, half hoping to see a rat again. Earlier, the creatures disgusted you. Now they appear almost desirable. Chroniclers note this too. In many prisons, rats were enemy at first, then resource. Their flesh roasted on torches, their bones sucked clean. Archaeological digs have found rodent bones charred in midden heaps, grim testimony to survival strategies. Your stomach twists violently, and you groan aloud. The sound startles you, as if your body is no longer your own. Hunger transforms flesh into parasite, devouring you from inside. Captives once described hunger as a second jailer, stricter than any guard. That phrase feels precise now. And yet, hunger does not only weaken it, distorts thought. You begin to imagine meals with obsessive clarity. Bread so fresh steam rises from its crust. Stew thick with herbs, onions, fat. Wine poured dark and sweet. You close your eyes, and for a moment the vision nearly convinces you. You can almost taste it. Prisoners wrote of this too, phantom feasts conjured by starvation. Some claimed angels fed them. Others admitted it was only hallucination. Either way, the mind turns famine into banquet, cruelest of illusions. Specialists debate whether jailers starved prisoners deliberately or merely provided minimal rations. Some argue that nobles valued prisoners too much to risk their deaths. Others insist starvation itself was policy. breaking wills without blood. Perhaps both are true, but here, bent double with cramps, you know intent is irrelevant. Outcome is the same. Weakness, delirium, despair. You press onward, shuffling. Your legs feel boneless, your arms limp. Hunger saps not only strength but dignity. You would crawl if it promised crumbs. That is its final cruelty it makes, beasts of men. Chroniclers described nobles once proud, reduced to begging like beggars, licking bowls clean, trading secrets for crusts. You see how easily pride dissolves under hunger. Already you imagine lapping water from filth. Already you would barter anything for bread. A peculiar superstition once circulated. Some believed hunger revealed sins. They thought the stomach gnawed proportionally to guilt, punishing wrongdoers more harshly. Others said hunger cleansed, purifying soul by burning away flesh. Both beliefs reveal attempts to give meaning to emptiness. But for you, hunched and trembling, hunger feels less holy than hellish. You stumble into another chamber, and on the floor lies a scrap hard, misshapen mold blooming across it. Bread. Your first instinct is disgust. Your second is relief. You snatch it up, sniff it, gag at the stench. Yet your teeth sink in anyway. The taste is bitter, revolting, but your mouth waters fiercely. You chew, forcing yourself to swallow. For a moment, your belly thanks you. For another, bile rises. Your body cannot decide if it is grateful or betrayed. Captives describe this too, the agony of eating food too foul to stomach, yet too precious to waste. Archaeologists analyzing residue in latrine pits confirm these descriptions. They find seeds of weeds, fragments of straw, traces of bone, diets reduced to scraps unfit even for animals. Yet they also find proof of desperate ingenuity: ground nutshells, crushed roots. Hunger teaches invention. You sink back against wall, clutching your belly. Pain eases briefly, then returns sharper, as though mocking your effort. You realize no amount of moldy crusts could satisfy. You would need meals, and those will never come. Hunger here is not a problem to solve. It is permanent condition. Above, nobles gorge on venison, pheasant, fish, bread glazed with honey. Below, you gnaw fungus-laced crumbs, stomach twisting. The contrast sears worse than cold. And so you understand. One night here is impossible because hunger itself is infinite. It grows even as you feed it, stretching hours into torment. It makes food memory sharper, taunts you with phantom feasts, convinces you to chew leather, straw, vermin. You close your eyes, whispering again, though not prayer this time, only food names. Cheese, meat, wine. Each word slips out like litany, but no dish comes, no feast arrives. Only belly, twisting endlessly, until you no longer know if you crave life or merely relief. The dungeon does not need to strike you. Hunger is whip enough, and it never tires. You press onward, though, your belly knots with emptiness, and soon thirst sharpens alongside it. The dryness creeps first across your lips, cracking them until each smile or whisper becomes pain. Then it settles in your tongue, thickening it until speech feels foreign. Soon your throat scratches with every breath, and swallowing becomes futile. Hunger may gnaw you slowly, but thirst flays you quickly, stripping strength in hours instead of days. Captives once wrote of thirst with more desperation than of food. A prisoner in Rouen confessed that he licked stones, hoping moisture would cling to them. Another in Florence described pressing lips to damp straw, sucking mouldy water until he vomited. Historians sometimes question these accounts, but archaeological digs reveal mineral streaks where lips clearly pressed, discolorations from centuries of desperate mouths. The evidence proves what words only hinted. Thirst drives men to kiss stone. You crouch now, testing a crack with your tongue. It tastes only of grit, bitter and sharp. Yet for a heartbeat you imagine wetness. You swallow, but the illusion vanishes, leaving your throat rawer than before. A peculiar anecdote from Spain tells of prisoners who scraped moss from walls, chewing it like bread. They believed green meant life, and life meant water. Whether moss provided relief or only sickness remains debated, but the logic feels sound when your mouth feels like sand. You search for moss too, brushing walls frantically, though none appears here. One superstition whispered among captives claimed water hid in echoes. They believed dripping sounds guided them towards salvation, though often the drips were unreachable, falling into pits. Still, prisoners crawled, listening, chasing hope. Some fell into shafts and vanished. Others licked wet floors until their tongues bled. Was this madness or courage? Scholars hesitate to judge. You stagger onward, your own ears straining for that elusive drip. At last you hear it soft, rhythmic. You rush forward, stumble, drop to your knees. A trickle slides down stone, glistening faintly. You press lips to it greedily, sucking cold liquid. Relief floods instantly, sharp as ecstasy. For a moment you could weep with gratitude. But soon the taste turns bitter, metallic. It is not pure water but runoff, laced with rust and filth. Still, you drink, because thirst does not negotiate. Contemporary accounts confirm this degradation. Prisoners drank from gutters where waste mingled, knowing it sickened them but unable to resist. Some died of fever, others endured with stomachs churning. Archaeologists analyzing residue in old cisterns find traces of contamination. Lead, ash, feces. Survival was poisoned at its source. You collapse back, gasping, your belly cramps, already rejecting what you swallowed. Yet for now at least, thirst eases slightly. It will return soon, fiercer, but you cherish the fleeting reprieve. A peculiar discovery in Austrian castles shows crude cups carved from bone, left in cells. Did prisoners fashion them to collect drips? The thought is both pitiful and ingenious. You imagine waiting beneath cracks, holding out a cup for hours to gather a mouthful. Each drop would feel like treasure. Scholars remain divided about whether jailers denied water deliberately. Some argue captives received bowls at intervals. Others insist denial was common practice, designed to break will faster than hunger. Whichever is true, every record agrees. Thirst dominated thought. Men dreamed not of freedom, not of sunlight, but of streams and wells. You close your eyes, and instantly visions arise. Cool rivers winding through meadows, wells brimming with clear water, springs bubbling fresh from earth. You can almost hear it gurgle, almost feel it washing your throat. But the vision hurts worse than reality, because it dissolves the moment you open your eyes. The dungeon denies, even dreams. One prisoner in England carved a cup into stone, complete with handles, though it could never hold liquid. Scholars call it madness, but perhaps it was prayer. Perhaps by carving a cup, he carved hope. You understand his need, because already your hands twitch to draw shapes in air. You stumble forward again, though dizziness spins your vision. Lack of water shrinks strength faster than lack of food. Your steps drag, your tongue sticks to teeth, your thoughts blur. Even hallucinations grow dry, you cannot conjure feasts anymore, only rivers. You murmur their names: Thames, Rhine, Nile, words of water, litany of thirst. Above, nobles sip wine, sweet and spiced, pouring cups freely. Below, you suck rust and filth from cracks, grateful even for poison. The contrast is so sharp it almost kills you. And now you know, one night here is impossible not only because of cold, hunger, or silence. It is impossible because thirst reduces you faster than chains. It strips language, dignity, thought. It makes you animal, crawling on all fours, licking stone. You press your lips together, though cracks sting. You close your eyes, whispering one last word: water. The sound echoes, mocking you. And then silence swallows it, leaving only dryness, endless and absolute. You lean against the wall, throat burning, belly twisting, skin crawling. Every torment you have endured, cold, silence, vermin, filth, hunger, thirst, has hollowed you out, leaving only a trembling husk. And yet somehow, the dungeon still finds one more cruelty to inflict: despair. It arrives quietly, not with screams or blows, but with a whisper inside your mind that tells you there is no end. You feel it now, heavier than chains, colder than drafts. It says, "This is forever." Captives once described despair as though it were another prisoner sharing the cell. One man in Burgundy wrote that, "Despair sat beside me, more constant than the rats." Another in Naples said he could feel it, clutching my shoulders, whispering of eternity. Historians debate whether these were metaphors or the first fumbling descriptions of depression, but their words capture what you feel. Despair has shape here, and it presses close. You slide down the wall, too weak to stand. The stone chills your back, but you no longer resist. You stare into blackness, and for the first time you stop imagining freedom. That is despair's true victory, not in pain, but in erasing hope. Archaeologists studying graffiti in dungeons note a sharp contrast. Some inscriptions burst with prayers and names, others stop abruptly, unfinished, as though the carver dropped tools mid-stroke. These abrupt endings, experts suggest, mark the moment despair claimed them. Hope-etched lines, despair silenced hands. You trace the wall beside you, but no strength remains to scratch your name. You wonder if this is how so many faded, not violently but quietly, as hope ebbed away. A peculiar superstition circulated among captives. They believed despair itself was a demon. They whispered that it slid through cracks like draughts, fed on sighs, grew fat on silence. Some claimed it pressed on chests until breathing stopped. Guards mocked such tales, but even they admitted prisoners often died without wound or illness. They simply gave up. Whether demon or despair, the effect was the same. You close your eyes, and for a moment you imagine warmth. Not fire this time, not feasts, not rivers, just sunlight on your skin. The image is faint, fragile, and it flickers away almost instantly. Despair denies even memory, bleaching colour from visions until only grey remains. One prisoner in England carved his final words, "No one will come." Scholars call it melodrama, but the words ring truer than any chronicle. That is despair's final lesson: you are forgotten. Even if the door opened now, even if the guards beckoned, you would not rise. Hope has already died. You feel it creeping now, numbing limbs, dulling thoughts, and yet, ironically, despair brings strange peace. Pain matters less. It softens edges, muffles fears. Perhaps this is why some prisoners embraced it, calling it mercy. A French monk wrote that despair was the dungeon's priest, giving last rites before death. Grim poetry, but apartment. Above, nobles debate politics, their voices sharp with ambition. Below, despair silences all voices, rendering ambitions meaningless. The contrast is not only cruel, it is cosmic. You sink lower, body folding inward. Your breath slows, chest rising shallowly. Perhaps this is the end. Perhaps this is how every prisoner finished. Not with defiance, not with struggle, but with surrender. And then, faintly, you hear again the drip of water, the shuffle of rats, the groan of stone. The dungeon reminds you of life, but not of freedom. Life here is endurance without purpose. And so despair completes its work. Now you understand. You would not last a night in a freezing medieval dungeon, not simply because of hunger, thirst, cold, vermin, filth, or silence. You would not last because despair would smother you long before dawn. You close your eyes, whisper one last plea, whether to God, or to stone, or to no one at all, you do not know. And in that whisper the dungeon claims another voice, another life, another memory. And now, dear listener, we step slowly back from the darkness. You have walked with me through cold corridors, heard the echoes of chains, felt the press of stone against your skin. You have tasted hunger and thirst, and you have endured silence until it rang louder than screams. But here, at the close of this long night, you may let it go. Let the dungeon fade. Let the heavy walls dissolve into nothing. Picture instead a warm bed around you, blankets tucked gently to your chin. Imagine the quiet now not as menace but as comfort, the kind of hush that cradles you instead of crushing you. Your body begins to soften into rest. Where once you felt drafts, now you feel only steady warmth. Where once you heard drips and moans, now you hear only calm rhythm of your own breath. Each inhale is smooth, each exhale slower, easing you deeper. The prisoners of centuries past may remain in their stone cells, but you are free. You walk out into fresh air, into dawn's first glow, into meadows wide and open. Sunlight touches your face, gentle, steady, forgiving. You do not need to fight for it. It is yours already. So close your eyes. Let images soften. Let muscles release. Rest in the knowledge that while the dungeon may have been real for others, for you it is only story. And stories, once finished, let us sleep. Good night, my friend. May your dreams carry you to places of warmth, of laughter, of company. May you wake with lightness, far from stone. And may the night ahead cradle you gently, without hunger, without thirst, without despair, only quiet, only peace. Sweet dreams.